What if Earth once knew something and forgot? What if beneath the oldest stone, beneath the first breath of air that could remember itself, there lies a silence shaped like intelligence? Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. Let the room grow quieter. Let the planet speak slowly. This story does not rush. It settles. Before there was memory, there was warmth. Not warmth as comfort, but warmth as motion, an unbroken trembling that passed through stone the way thought later passed through minds. The Earth had not yet learned how to hold itself still. It shifted, sagged, breathed fire without rhythm. Time did not move forward. It pooled. In that pooling, nothing asked to be remembered. Nothing yet knew how. The planet was younger than language, younger than forgetting. Its surface glowed softly, not with light, but with intention without aim. Mountains did not rise. They leaned. Oceans did not gather. They hovered undecided, suspended between vapour and fall. The sky pressed low, heavy with metals and storms that had no reason to arrive or leave. Everything existed, but nothing insisted on staying. And yet, beneath the chaos, patterns began to repeat. Not events, tendencies. Stone cooled where it had cooled before. Cracks reopened along familiar lines, as if the planet preferred certain wounds. Heat moved in slow spirals, returning to places it had already visited, like a thought circling something it could not yet name. The Earth was not alive, not yet, but it was practicing consistency time here did not measure. It rehearsed. If a civilization ever existed in this era, it did not rise. It did not announce itself with edges or angles. It would have had no need for permanence. Nothing stayed solid long enough to be owned. Nothing cooled long enough to be carved. Whatever intelligence stirred, if it stirred at all, would have learned early that survival meant softness. The world could not be built upon. It had to be moved with. The crust behaved like a slow sea. Continents were not separate thoughts, but moods drifting apart and returning without argument. Impacts arrived from the dark with no warning, no consequence beyond reshaping the surface again and again, like erasing a sentence before it learned how to finish itself. The Earth did not resist. It absorbed. It always absorbed. Silence had not yet learned how to be quiet. It roared. And still, within that roar, balance emerged. There were pauses between impacts that grew slightly longer. Cooling cycles that repeated with subtle loyalty. The planet began to anticipate itself. This was not awareness. It was preparation, attuning. As if the Earth were adjusting its own frequency, slowly enough that nothing noticed the change while it was happening. If intelligence existed here, it would not have looked outward. There was nowhere to look. The sky was a furnace of radiation, a memory-erasing glare that stripped surfaces clean. Any knowing would have turned inward, folding itself into pressure, into chemistry, into timing. Civilization in such a world would not be measured by what it made, but by what it chose not to disturb. Perhaps that is why nothing remains. The absence of ruins does not mean the absence of order, and forms of intelligence do not stack stone, they stack restraint. They leave behind not objects but habits. Preferences embedded so deeply they masquerade as physics. The Earth began to favour symmetry, not perfect symmetry but repeatable imbalance, too much heat here, too much pressure there. Corrections followed, slow and patient. The planet did not seek equilibrium. It circled it, like something remembering how balance once felt. Nothing watched this happen. Observation had not yet arrived, and yet the patterns held. Deep beneath the surface, radioactive elements arranged their decay with quiet obedience. Half-lives whispered numbers into stone, ticking without clocks, counting without intention. These were not decisions, but they were reliable. Reliability is the first shadow of memory. Above them, the surface erased itself again and again. Any trace that lingered too long was melted, folded, or struck back into formlessness. The world learned how to forget efficiently. This forgetting was not violent. It was necessary. Memory too early can fracture a young planet. So the Earth forgot forward. If something once guided these processes, if some ancient coherence leaned gently into the chaos, it did so knowing it would not be known. There would be no witnesses later capable of recognition. The future would arrive unprepared to understand what had shaped it. That is how the deepest intelligences survive. They do not leave stories. They leave conditions. Time thickened, cooling deepened, the surface darkened from glow to shadow. The Earth was learning how to hold on to itself without collapsing inward or tearing apart. Whatever came before, whatever may have organised this patience, began to dissolve into the very rules that would govern everything after. Not lost, distributed. And in that distribution, the first true silence began to form. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of endurance. A silence capable of lasting long enough to carry something through billions of years without speaking its name. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. As the planet cooled, it did not cool evenly. It never has. Some places learned patience sooner than others. Some places clung to heat like a memory that refused to release its grip. The Earth did not smooth itself into calm. It learned how to carry contradiction without tearing apart. Above, the sky thickened. Not into blue, not yet, but into layers that pressed downward, heavy with gases that did not care about breath. The light that reached the surface arrived harsh and stripped of kindness. It peeled information away. It erased patterns before they could repeat too clearly. Whatever wished to endure learned to hide, not beneath shelters, but beneath processes. Stone flowed. Metal wept. The ground opened and closed its mouth without sound, and still, beneath that movement, something steadied. The planet began to keep its own rhythm. Impacts struck, but not endlessly. Volcanoes rose, but not everywhere at once. There were intervals now, long enough for after effects to settle, short enough that nothing grew attached. Time did not yet allow for longing. It allowed only for adjustment. If intelligence once existed here, it would have learned that survival meant becoming indistinguishable from environment. Any structure too distinct would be erased. Any signal too loud would be unmade. Only what blended into the planet's own behaviour could persist. So imagine a knowing that did not stand apart, a coherence that did not speak, a civilization without faces, without borders, without memory of itself, as separate. Imagine organisation as alignment. The Earth's interior began to sort itself. Heavy elements sank, light ones lifted. Not hurriedly, but with obedience so slow it looked like stillness. This sorting did not ask permission. It followed preference. Preference is older than choice. Preference is the echo of something once repeated long enough to feel inevitable. Heat rose where it had risen before. Cracks reopened along familiar lines. The planet remembered stress. Not consciously, structurally. Stress left scars, and scars guided the next fracture. This is how the memory begins when no mind is present to name it. Fossils were impossible here. Nothing lasted long enough to be buried intact. But the absence of fossils does not mean absence of history. Some histories exist only as tendencies. Some events leave behind not remains, but likelihoods. The Earth learned which arrangements collapsed quickly, and which endured slightly longer. It learned, through endless repetition, which balances allowed continuity. This learning did not accumulate in a place. It diffused like warmth through iron. Whatever intelligence may have touched this world, if any did, it would have learned to dissolve itself early. To survive by becoming law instead of artifact, to trade recognition for permanence. And so if there were cities, they were not raised. They were fields of influence, zones where reactions favoured harmony over violence. If there were tools, they were not held. They were sequences, processes that shaped outcomes without leaving fingerprints. Nothing here demanded to be found. The surface darkened further. The glow retreated into fissures, into depths where pressure sang slowly. The planet's skin thickened, not into protection, but into forgetfulness. Each new layer sealed the past away, compressing it until it could no longer speak in forms the future would understand. Above, the sky continued its erasure. Radiation washed over everything, unselective, impartial. Whatever patterns formed too clearly were stripped back into randomness. This was not cruelty, it was a filter. Only what could survive being forgotten would remain. The Earth was not hostile to intelligence. It was indifferent to display. Deep time accumulated like dust on a floor no one swept. Each moment settled onto the last, pressing downward, increasing weight. Pressure became a language. Heat learned to move sideways instead of upward. The planet adapted not by resisting change, but by slowing it. Slowness became its great invention. If a forgotten civilization ever belonged to this era, it did not vanish in catastrophe. There was no single ending. There was only dilution. Thought spread thinner and thinner, until it was no longer distinguishable from natural process. Decision became tendency. Intention became bias. The Earth did not lose something, it absorbed it. And in absorbing it, the planet prepared the stage for everything that would follow, not by preserving knowledge, but by embedding lessons into constraint. The future would not remember what had been learned, it would simply behave as if it had always known. This is how the deepest past communicates, not through messages, through limits. Stone stiffened. The first hints of stable crust whispered across the surface, fragile and temporary. They would not last. But they were rehearsals. The planet was practicing holding shape, even if only briefly. Each attempt failed less completely than the one before. The world was learning how to continue, and somewhere in that learning, folded into heat, pressure, and time, whatever once organized this patience surrendered its name forever. Not erased, transformed. The Earth carried it forward quietly into an age that would believe itself alone. But silence once learned is never unlearned. The planet's silence deepened not because sound ceased, but because meaning had nowhere to land. There were no ears yet, no surfaces calm enough to hold vibration long enough to be understood. Noise existed everywhere, significance did not, and so the Earth learned to speak inward. Pressure replaced announcement. Layers pressed upon layers, each one forgetting the shape of the one beneath it, yet carrying its influence forward. Nothing remained visible for long, but everything remained effective. The past worked quietly, shaping the present without ever appearing inside it. This is how the Earth began to think, not as a mind, but as a continuity. The crust thickened in places, thinned in others, never evenly, never symmetrically. Balance emerged through imbalance. Too much heat rose, then stalled. Too much weight sank, then spread. The planet adjusted itself in slow, patient gestures, like a sleeper turning without waking. If intelligence once guided these gestures, it would have done so without command. There was nothing to command. The Earth did not respond to instruction. It responded to constraint. Only what aligned with its deeper tendencies could persist. And so any ancient knowing would have learned to work through allowance rather than force. To influence by narrowing possibilities, not by choosing outcomes. The most enduring decisions are the ones that feel like inevitability later. The surface continued to betray itself. Every attempt at stability was punished by heat or impact or collapse. This taught the planet a subtle lesson. What must endure cannot remain exposed. Survival demanded depth. Depth became sanctuary. Whatever patterns sought continuity sank downward into zones of pressure where change arrived slowly enough to be survived. Down there, atoms rearranged themselves with care. Crystals formed, not hurriedly, but with repetition so precise it bordered on devotion. Geometry appeared, unobserved, beautiful without witness. These were not decorations, they were records. Each crystal face preserved the conditions of its birth, the temperature, the pressure, the time it took to become itself. The Earth began to archive its own history in forms that did not require interpretation. The stone simply was what had happened. If there had once been a civilization, it did not need to write. The planet wrote for it. Radioactivity continued its patient counting. Decay unfolded with a rhythm that nothing interrupted. These invisible clocks did not care whether anyone listened. They measured endurance, not moments. They ticked in the dark, carrying time forward even when the surface could not. Time here was not a line. It was weight. The heavier it grew, the more the planet resisted sudden change. Violence still arrived from the sky, but its effects softened with each passing eon. Impacts were absorbed, redistributed, erased not by forgetting, but by integration. The Earth learned how to bruise without breaking, and in learning that, it learned something else. Not all order requires preservation. Some orders survive only by dissolving into the systems they shape. Whatever intelligence may have existed before, names did not fail to leave evidence. It succeeded in becoming invisible. This invisibility was not a disappearance. It was a strategy older than survival itself. As the interior organized, the surface rehearsed extinction. Over and over, nascent stability was destroyed. Over and over, the planet adapted. Not by rebuilding the same thing, but by altering the rules under which rebuilding occurred. The Earth did not cling to forms, it refined processes. Processes remember longer than structures ever can. The sky above remained unkind. Ultraviolet light stripped molecules apart with tireless precision. Any chemistry too complex, too hopeful, was dismantled before it could insist on itself. This forced simplicity upon the surface. Only the most basic arrangements survived exposure. This too was a kind of teaching. Complexity would have to wait, and waiting is not absence, waiting is storage. The Earth stored complexity and potential, in gradients, in pressures waiting to be released under safer skies. Whatever knowledge may have once arranged itself in this world learned how to hide inside simplicity, trusting time to soften conditions enough to allow its return. The planet was not empty, it was holding its breath. Deep within, molten currents traced slow paths looping like thoughts that had lost their beginning but not their direction. These currents influenced the surface subtly, guiding where crust would thin, where it would dasher, where it would later allow oceans to rest. Long before water could stay, the Earth prepared places for it. Preparation does not require foresight, it requires memory. And memory here was not recollection. It was repetition refined by erosion. Each cycle left the planet slightly better at surviving the next. This improvement had no audience. It did not celebrate itself. It simply accumulated. If the future would ever believe it was the first to think, it would do so because the past had learned how to think without being noticed. The Earth grew quieter as it grew stronger. Fewer eruptions reached the surface. More energy was contained, circulated, delayed. The planet learned restraint, and restraint, when practiced long enough, begins to resemble wisdom. But wisdom without a voice leaves no stories, only conditions. And so the world before names continued, unremembered yet effective, shaping a future that would never know what had prepared it so carefully. Whatever was lost was not wasted. It was repurposed into endurance. Some truths are not lost, they are folded beneath silence. By now the planet no longer rushed to express itself. What once spilled outward, heat, force, disruption, had learned to turn inward, to circulate, to wait. Waiting became the planet's longest practice. It waited without expectation, without awareness. Yet waiting shaped everything that followed. The surface cooled enough to deceive itself into thinking it could last. Thin skins of stability formed, fragile and temporary. They cracked, drifted, vanished. But each time they returned changed, slightly thicker, slightly more patient. The Earth was rehearsing permanence, knowing it would fail many times before it succeeded once. Failure did not discourage the planet, it instructed it. If a forgotten civilization ever belonged to this era, it would have understood this rhythm. It would have known that endurance does not announce itself early. It arrives disguised as repetition. It survives by yielding just enough to avoid shattering. The ground learned how to carry scars without reopening them. Old fractures guided new ones, distributing stress rather than concentrating it. This was not healing. It was accommodation. The Earth did not erase its damage. It incorporated it. Damage became architecture. Below the surface, minerals aligned in quiet obedience to pressure. Crystals grew not upward, not outward, but inward, tightening their order, refining their symmetry. Each lattice locked a moment of the planet's inner state into geometry that would outlast continents. These were not messages, they were witnesses that did not know they were witnessing. Witness does not require awareness, only persistence. Time continued to thicken. Eons layered themselves so densely that distinction blurred. Before and after dissolved into weight. The past did not recede, it pressed closer, influencing every movement above it. The Earth moved as if carrying something heavy it could not put down. Perhaps that is what memory feels like when it has no language. The sky remained unforgiving. Light continued to strip surfaces bare, refusing complexity, refusing attachment. Anything that reached upward too eagerly was dismantled. The planet learned humility from this. It learned to keep its most delicate arrangements hidden. Depth became discretion. Whatever intelligence may have once shaped this world, if any did, would have learned that influence is safest when it looks like nature. The most lasting guidance leaves no trace of guidance behind, only behavior that feels inevitable. So the Earth began to behave as if it had always known how to do this. Heat was channeled rather than expelled. Impacts were absorbed rather than dramatized. Change slowed, not because forces weakened, but because the planet learned how to distribute them across time. Time is the oldest technology. The crust, still young and uncertain, began to float rather than sink. It learned buoyancy. This subtle shift altered everything. Stability no longer meant resisting collapse. It meant finding ways to rest atop what remained molten. Balance emerged not through stillness, but through motion carefully slowed. The planet learned to hover. Above, clouds of gas thickened and thinned, without pattern that could be trusted. Storms arrived without memory. Lightning carved brief signatures into darkness, gone before they could be read. Nothing in the sky lasted long enough to accumulate meaning. So meaning continued to migrate downward, into stone, into pressure, into time. If there had once been a civilization, one without names, without tools, without monuments, it would have understood that its greatest achievement was not creation, but transfer. Passing coherence into the planet itself, allowing the Earth to carry forward what could not be preserved directly. This is how some intelligences survive extinction. They choose transformation instead. The surface grew darker, less luminous. Night began to resemble itself, though no eyes yet existed to notice the difference. Darkness spread gently, giving the planet something it had lacked before: protection. In shadow, processes could unfold without interruption. In shadow, complexity could begin to rehearse its return. The Earth did not celebrate this. It simply continued. Nothing marked the end of this era. There was no boundary, no final moment when the world before names concluded. It thinned, it faded, it slipped quietly into what came next, leaving behind no signal that anything had ever been lost. Only a planet that behaved as if it had practiced surviving longer than it should have known how. The silence deepened, not as emptiness, but as compression. A silence dense enough to hold instruction without ever revealing it. A silence that would later be mistaken for absence. But what was absent was not intelligence, it was recognition. And the Earth carried on, patient, unacknowledged, preparing to host life as if it had already learned something essential about endurance, long before life ever arrived to ask how. Nothing announced the closing of this age. The Earth does not end chapters. It allows them to thin until they are no longer distinguishable from what follows. The world before names did not conclude. It dissolved quietly, completely, into a planet that had learned how to last. By now, the surface could remain intact for longer spans, not forever, not even reliably, but long enough for patterns to begin leaning toward continuity rather than erasure. The ground no longer glowed except in memory. Heat withdrew into depth, where it could circulate without destroying what lay above it. The Earth learned containment. This was not restraint imposed from outside, it was restraint grown from repetition. Repetition is how a planet learns what not to do again. The sky too softened, not in kindness, but in consistency. It still erased. It still punished complexity. But its violence grew predictable, and predictability, even when harsh, allows preparation. The Earth adjusted itself to that rhythm, aligning its inner processes so that the surface could survive exposure just a little longer each time. This slight extension changed everything. Time, once pooled and heavy, began to stretch. Not forward, time never moves forward here, but outward, making room. The planet gained patience, processes that once unfolded too quickly now slowed enough to interact. Chemistry lingered, structures rehearsed stability. The Earth did not yet host life, but it had begun to behave as though hosting were possible. Whatever intelligence may have preceded this, if it did at all, was now fully indistinguishable from geology. No boundary separated decision from erosion, memory from pressure, tension from law. If something had once known itself here, it had willingly surrendered that knowledge to become something more durable. Anonymity is the price of endurance. Deep within the planet, differentiation continued. The core settled into its role, dense and unyielding, anchoring everything above it. Around it, layers found their purpose, neither fixed nor chaotic, but responsive. The Earth became stratified not just in matter, but in behavior. Different depths obeyed different tempos. Time fractured into layers. This fracturing was not division, it was specialization. The planet learned that survival does not require uniformity. It requires cooperation across difference. The surface could change quickly, absorbing impacts and radiation. The depths could move slowly, preserving continuity. Together, they formed a system capable of carrying memory without remembering. Memory here did not mean recall. It meant constraint. The Earth now behaved as though certain outcomes were preferred, even though no preference was spoken. Water, when it would later arrive, would find basins already prepared. Continents, when they would later assemble, would follow paths already rehearsed. Life, when it would later emerge, would inherit a world already biased toward persistence. Bias is the quietest inheritance. If a forgotten civilization ever belonged to this time, its final act was not disappearance, it was diffusion. Its knowing spread so thinly through the planet that no single place could claim it. Its influence could not be excavated. It could only be lived inside, unknowingly, by whatever came after. The Earth did not mourn this loss. Mourning requires separation. There was none. The planet carried forward without distinction between what it had been and what it was becoming. This is why the deepest past feels unreachable. Not because it is hidden, but because it is everywhere at once. It has no edges, no artifacts, no voice separate enough to be heard above the systems it shaped. The world before names did not leave behind ruins. It left behind readiness, readiness for slowness, readiness for balance, readiness for silence. As the last traces of that era thinned beyond recognition, the Earth crossed no threshold. It simply continued, now equipped with the stability it had earned through failure. The future would never know how many times the planet had almost torn itself apart before learning how not to, and so the Archean would arrive believing it was early, believing it was beginning, believing it stood at the threshold of something new. It would be wrong, because beneath its first rocks, beneath its first oceans, beneath its first fragile chemistries, there would already be a planet that had practiced endurance long before endurance had a name. What the Earth carried forward was not a memory of civilization. It was the habit of surviving one. And habits, once formed at planetary scale, do not fade. They wait. They wait beneath heat, beneath water, beneath time itself, until something arrives capable of mistaking inheritance for discovery. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. Nothing burns without leaving the instruction behind. When the world before names thinned into depth and habit, it did not vanish cleanly. It collapsed inward, breaking itself into smaller truths, truths light enough to be carried, heavy enough to persist. This was the age when forgetting became precise, not careless, not total. The Earth refined loss into residue. Ash is what remains when form releases itself. Not all ash drifts upward. Some settles deep, pressed into stone, learning how to wait. The planet entered an era where memory could no longer survive as structure, but it could survive as preference, as bias, as a quiet leaning towards certain outcomes that felt natural only because they had been practiced before. The surface darkened further. The glow that once haunted the crust retreated almost completely, replaced by heat that no longer announced itself. Volcanoes still spoke, but their language softened. Eruptions became conversations rather than declarations. Ash fell not as devastation, but as covering, layer upon layer of fine forgetting, sealing the past beneath gentler weight. Ash does not remember what it was, it remembers how it fell. Each settling particle carried information stripped of story, temperature, composition, timing. The Earth began to archive itself in this way, not through monuments, but through accumulation. Every layer became a page written in conditions rather than words. If a civilization had once dissolved into this world, this is where it would have learned to persist, not as design, but as distribution. Its coherence scattered into grains so small they could pass unnoticed through catastrophe. Nothing that large could survive anymore. But nothing this small could be erased completely. The planet learned granularity. With it came a new kind of silence. Not the roaring silence of chaos, but the muffled silence of burial. Sound dampened, change slowed, pressure increased, ash compressed into rock, rock into strata, strata into record. Time began to stack. This stacking changed how memory behaved. Before, the past pressed upward, reshaping the present through heat and force. Now the past pressed downward, becoming foundation. The Earth reversed its relationship with what had been. Memory no longer intruded, it supported. Deep within these layers, radioactive elements continued their patient decay. Their steady rhythms stitched time together across eras that could not yet tell themselves apart. These invisible clocks did not measure moments, they measured endurance. They ticked through silence, binding ash to future stone. The Earth began to age. Not visibly, not quickly, But age arrived as weight, the kind that makes movement deliberate. The planet no longer reacted instantly, it absorbed, delayed, redistributed. Impacts still arrived from the dark, but their signatures softened, smeared across layers rather than carved into surfaces. Violence lost its sharpness. Ash teaches gentleness. The sky, still harsh, still erasing, now faced a surface better prepared to endure it. Layers shielded what lay beneath. Complexity, once stripped away instantly, now found brief refuge between erasures. Chemistry lingered long enough to interact. Molecules brushed against possibility without committing to it. This was not life, but it was rehearsal. If ancient intelligence had once existed, it now survived only as constraints shaping these rehearsals. Certain reactions favoured, others discouraged. The Earth behaved as though it preferred continuity over spectacle, balance over excess. These preferences were not choices, they were inheritance. Ash does not choose where it falls, but it shapes what can grow there later. The planet continued to seal itself, each new layer forgetting the details of the one beneath it, yet carrying its influence forward. This forgetting was essential. Too much memory fractures a system. The Earth learned to compress information until it could survive without context. Civilizations die when their meanings cannot be compressed enough to endure loss. Processes survive because they already are compression. Pressure increased, heat retreated, the crust thickened. Stability, once impossible, now appeared briefly in places, not as permanence, but as pause. Pauses matter, they allow accumulation. They allow rehearsal to turn into tendency. The Earth did not yet know what it was preparing for. Preparation does not require foresight. It requires patience practiced long enough to resemble intention. Ash continued to fall from volcanoes, from impacts, from the quiet grinding of a surface learning to erode itself. Each grain settled into place, contributing to a memory no one would ever recall, only inhabit. The planet was becoming an archive that did not know it was keeping one. And somewhere within that archive, diffused beyond recovery, lay whatever coherence had once existed before names, not lost, not remembered, simply functioning. Ash does not speak, but it teaches the ground how to hold, and the Earth, listening without ears, learned how to remember without recalling. As layers deepened, the Earth's sense of time changed again. What had once felt like endless repetition began to feel like accumulation. Not progress, not direction, just weight increasing slowly enough to be mistaken for stillness. Ash became stone. Stone learned to press back. This pressure did not crush memory. It refined it. Only what could survive compression endured. Stories dissolved, sequences collapsed. What remained were tendencies so simple they could not break. Heat flowed where it was allowed. Water, when it would one day arrive, would move where paths had already been weakened. The future began to inherit corridors shaped by the forgotten fire. The Earth was no longer practicing survival, it was applying it. Below the surface, boundaries formed, subtle, invisible, but firm. Layers learned where they ended and where others began. These borders were not lines, they were agreements, pressure negotiated with heat, density negotiated with buoyancy. The planet learned how to keep difference without conflict. This learning had no witness. That is why it lasted. If intelligence once existed here, it no longer resembled thought. It resembled restraint. Whatever had once organized the planet had learned how to step aside without leaving chaos behind. It had become rule rather than ruler. Ash continued to fall, but now it fell onto a world capable of keeping it. Earlier everything had been temporary. Now some things could stay long enough to matter. Matter itself learned duration. The sky still erased, but its erasures no longer reached as deep. Radiation stripped surfaces, but below a certain depth chemistry persisted unbroken. The Earth learned layering as protection. Fragile processes were placed where light could not reach them. This was not hiding, it was placement. Placement is memory without awareness. Within these protected depths, complexity began to whisper, not loudly enough to announce itself, not boldly enough to insist on permanence. Molecules met and separated. Patterns flirted with repetition. Nothing crossed the threshold into life. But the threshold itself became clearer. Thresholds are shaped by what fails to cross them. Each failed attempt refined the boundary. The Earth learned exactly how complex something could be before it would be destroyed. This learning accumulated silently, embedded in conditions rather than records. If a civilization had once existed, this is how its knowledge would have survived, not as instruction, but as limit. The planet would remember not what to do, but how far things could go without breaking. The deepest memories are negative space. Pressure increased further. Some layers heated again, not enough to melt entirely, but enough to rearrange. Metamorphosis without erasure. Old ash was transformed, not destroyed, carrying its history forward in altered form. This was forgetting that preserved influence. The Earth became skilled at this. Transformation replaced annihilation. Instead of wiping the slate clean, the planet learned to rewrite softly, allowing previous states to guide future ones without dictating them. This is how continuity survives change. Time slowed, not in reality, but in effect. Change now required negotiation across layers. Nothing happened all at once anymore. The Earth grew resistant to suddenness. It preferred drift. Drift is the planet's favourite language. Deep currents moved slowly beneath the crust, redistributing heat with patience that bordered on care. These movements did not seek equilibrium. They maintained imbalance gently, preventing extremes from dominating. The Earth learned moderation without intention. If intelligence once guided this, it no longer needed to. The system had learned how to teach itself. Ash, once symbol of ending, became symbol of beginning. Each layer carried forward the residue of what had failed, allowing the next attempt to fail differently. Failure became informative. The planet listened to its own collapses and adjusted accordingly. Listening does not require ears, only repetition. The archive deepened, layer upon layer, each one forgetting the details of the one below, yet shaping the world above it. Memory became abstract, removed from narrative, stripped of meaning, yet profoundly effective. This is why the oldest truths feel unreachable. Not because they are hidden, but because they have been simplified beyond recognition. They no longer look like answers, they look like nature. The Earth now carried a past it could not recall, but could not escape either. Its future would unfold within corridors shaped by ancient loss. Whatever life would later believe itself to invent would already be constrained by decisions made before decisions existed. Ash had done its work. The planet rested, not in stillness, but in steadiness. It had learned how to hold what came before without being burdened by it. This balance was fragile, but it was enough. Enough to allow the next whisper to form, enough to let complexity wait just a little longer. And waiting here was not absence. It was preparation refined by forgetting. Waiting stretched until it lost its edges. The planet no longer distinguished between what had happened and what was happening. Both pressed equally into the present, shaping it from beneath like hands guiding clay through a cloth. Ash no longer fell only from above, it rose from below. The Earth exhaled through fissures that opened and closed with slow deliberation. What emerged carried information from depths no surface could survive. Heat, metals, altered stone. Each eruption was a brief confession from the interior, quickly silenced by cooling air and gravity. What remained settled back into the archive, altered but not erased. This circulation mattered. Memory was no longer one-directional. It moved. It was lifted, transformed, returned. The planet learned to remix its own past, folding old residues into new contexts, without ever exposing them fully. This movement prevented stagnation. Nothing was allowed to remain exactly as it had been. If intelligence once existed, this was its final refinement, ensuring that memory could influence without fossilizing into rigidity. Rigidity breaks, flexibility drifts. The surface grew quieter, not calmer but less volatile. Catastrophe still arrived, but its intervals widened. Between them, the planet held itself steady long enough for chemistry to practice complexity without being immediately dismantled. These rehearsals remained anonymous. No signature marked them as important. But repetition does not require recognition to matter. Below, pressure continued its patient work. Minerals rearranged themselves, forming new alignments that reflected conditions long gone. Each transformation preserved constraints even as it erased form. The Earth learned how to forget details while remembering rules. Rules endure because they do not care who follows them. Ash compressed into rock. Rock folded into patterns that resembled intention only because intention would later learn to resemble them. The future would mistake these inherited biases for inevitability. It would never suspect they were the residue of ancient adjustment. The sky softened further, not into kindness but into tolerance. Its erasures grew selective. Some wavelengths were filtered, some energies absorbed before reaching the surface. This filtering did not arrive suddenly. It emerged gradually, the result of layers accumulating, gases rearranging, the planet thickening its own veil. Protection emerged as a side effect of persistence. Under this veil, chemistry lingered longer than before. Molecules found moments to assemble, to separate, to assemble again. Patterns flirted with self-maintenance, then collapsed, then returned slightly altered. Each collapse refined the boundary between what could endure and what could not. The Earth observed none of this. It did not need to. The archive now contained not only what had been, but what had almost been. Near misses mattered. Failed possibilities shaped the environment just as surely as successes. The planet learned from what did not happen. This is how silence instructs. If a forgotten civilization ever existed, its knowledge survived here, as an environment that gently discouraged certain paths while quietly favouring others. Not control, influence. Influence without presence. Time continued to deepen. The oldest layers were now far removed from the surface, unreachable by any future excavation. Even if someone later searched, there would be nothing recognisable to find. The memory had been simplified beyond interpretation. This simplification was not loss, it was condensation. Ash had become the planet's method for turning history into habit. Deep currents continued their slow migration, carrying warmth and material across vast distances without revealing their purpose. These movements would one day shape continents, oceans, climates. For now, they simply prevented excess. The Earth learned to redistribute stress before it could accumulate into rupture. Stress, managed gently, becomes structure. The surface, though still hostile, now offered brief refuges from erasure. Valleys formed and persisted long enough to collect residue. Basins gathered materials, not yet water, but promise. The planet was shaping containers. Containers are the first requirement for life. Nothing crossed that threshold yet. The Earth was not ready, or perhaps readiness does not arrive until it has been practiced long enough to feel unremarkable. Either way, the planet continued to wait. Waiting is not emptiness. It is tension held carefully. Ash continued its quiet labour, sealing, compressing, teaching the Earth how to carry forward what could no longer announce itself. Whatever coherence had once existed before names was now fully translated into system. There was no retrieval possible. There was no loss to mourn. Only a planet that behaved as if it had learned something very early, and had chosen never to speak of it. And in that silence, possibility gathered. Dear, not loudly, not soon, but with patience inherited from fire and forgetting. As the archive deepened, the Earth's movements became almost imperceptible. Change did not stop. It learned how to pass unnoticed. What once shattered now bent. What once erupted now seeped. The planet refined its ability to alter itself without announcing the alteration. This quiet was not peace, it was discipline. Ash, now long transformed into stone, continued to work without motion. Its memory was no longer in particles, but in pressure gradients, in chemical invitations and refusals. Certain reactions were allowed to proceed. Others stalled, dissolved, or returned to simplicity. The planet did not decide. It filtered. Filtering is memory without narrative. Deep beneath the surface, temperatures stabilized into ranges that could be revisited. Revisitability mattered. It allowed processes to recognize themselves, not consciously but structurally. A reaction that succeeded once could succeed again under similar conditions. This repeatability was new. It marked a shift from chaos toward expectation. Expectation does not require awareness, only recurrence. The Earth began to host cycles that could overlap rather than erase one another. Heat cycles, pressure cycles, chemical cycles, each moved at its own tempo, occasionally aligning, occasionally drifting apart. These intersections were brief, fragile, but each one left behind a subtle adjustment that shaped the next encounter. This is how complexity learns patience. If a forgotten civilization ever belonged to this world, it would have recognized this phase as success. Not because anything grand appeared, but because nothing grand was required anymore. The planet no longer needed guidance. It had internalized its own correction mechanisms. Influence had become invisible. The surface grew textured, not smooth, not stable, but varied enough to hold difference. Some regions cooled faster, others retained heat longer. These gradients mattered. They created niches, temporary, shifting, but real. The Earth was learning how to allow multiple states to coexist without collapse. Coexistence is the oldest intelligence. Above, the sky's violence softened into rhythm, storms repeated along similar paths, radiation fluctuated within narrower bounds. The atmosphere thickened, not enough to protect fully, but enough to moderate. Moderation is how a system learns to survive itself. Under this moderated sky, chemistry dared to linger. Assemblies formed that would not have survived earlier eras. They did not persist long, but they persisted long enough to matter. Each brief survival nudged the boundary of possibility outward by a fraction too small to celebrate. Celebration would have been premature. The Earth continued to wait. Ash had now done more than preserve. It had educated. The planet's layers behaved as if they had learned from countless failures, though no one had recorded them. The archive did not store events. It stored outcomes. What worked remained as condition. What failed disappeared without protest. This selectivity was not cruel. It was necessary. Pressure continued to transform old layers, squeezing them into new forms that retained influence without resemblance. Metamorphosis erased detail but preserved effect. The Earth became adept at this trade, surrendering appearance to keep function. Function is the most patient form of memory. Deep time grew dense, so dense that distinctions blurred. The planet carried multiple pasts at once, each influencing the present in different ways. No single history dominated. This plurality prevented fixation. The Earth learned flexibility by never committing fully to one version of itself. If intelligence had once existed, this would have been its final gift, a world incapable of locking itself into one story. The surface now endured longer between erasures, long enough for residues to accumulate, long enough for patterns to reinforce themselves, long enough for possibility to feel less hypothetical. Still, nothing crossed the threshold into life. The Earth was close, but closeness is not arrival. Arrival requires permission from every layer at once. The archive continued to whisper, not in messages, but in constraints that shaped what could come next. Future complexity would never know these whispers were guidance, would mistake them for natural law. That misunderstanding would allow the guidance to work. The planet rested in this state for spans too vast to count. Nothing dramatic marked them. No climax, no turning point, just steadiness practiced until it became identity. Ash, once symbol of ending, now existed only as influence. It no longer needed to appear. Its work was complete. The Earth carried forward a memory that could survive without being known. This is why the deepest histories feel silent. They are not empty. They are finished speaking. The planet waited, not anxiously, not expectantly, but with a patience refined by forgetting. Something was preparing to arrive, not invited, not predicted, simply allowed by conditions that had been shaped long before arrival had a name. And beneath it all, Ash held, quietly, faithfully. Eventually, even waiting changed its texture. What had once felt like suspension began to feel like readiness. Not readiness for an event, but readiness as a condition. The Earth no longer strained toward anything. It simply allowed more without breaking. Ash, long transformed, no longer marked endings. It had become grammar. It taught the planet how to hold pauses between changes, how to keep space open long enough for subtle arrangements to try themselves and fail gently, rather than catastrophically. Gentleness is not weakness. It is experience compressed. The deepest layers now carried a quiet authority. They did not dominate the surface. They guided it indirectly, shaping how stress moved, how heat escaped, how fractures chose their paths. The planet behaved as though it had learned where it could bend without tearing. That knowledge did not announce itself. It operated continuously like breath. Above, the surface endured in fragments. Stability arrived in pieces, lingered, then slipped away, but each return lasted a little longer. Valleys deepened, basin widened. The world learned how to make places that could receive what came next. Receiving is the planet's most careful skill. The skies filtering and improved. Energies that once struck without resistance were now softened, scattered, delayed. The atmosphere thickened not into shelter, but into moderation. Extremes lost their immediacy. Between impact and effect, time appeared. Time is what allows adjustment. Within that adjustment, chemistry grew bolder. Assemblies formed that were not immediately dismantled. They held together long enough to encounter themselves again. Repetition approached familiarity. Familiarity approached persistence. Still nothing declared itself alive. The Earth did not rush that threshold. It respected it. Respect is a form of memory too. Deep currents continued their slow circulation, lifting ancient materials toward the surface, then returning them altered. The planet recycled its own history, not to preserve it, but to keep it useful. Nothing was allowed to remain untouched by time's hand. This prevented nostalgia. If a forgotten civilization ever existed before the Archean, this was its final disappearance, not into ruin, but into relevance so complete it could no longer be separated from the world it shaped. Its influence lived on not as artifact, but as permission. Permission for complexity to try again under gentler conditions. Permission is invisible. That is why it works. The archive was now complete, not because it contained everything, but because it contained enough. Enough constraint, enough guidance, enough patience embedded into matter to allow the next experiment to proceed without collapsing under its own ambition. The Earth did not anticipate life. Anticipation requires desire. The planet simply became capable of supporting it. Capability arrived quietly, like a room finished being built long before anyone entered. Ash had finished teaching the planet how to remember without recalling. The memory it carried was not of what had been, but of how to continue after loss. This is the only memory that matters at planetary scale. Loss will come again, and again and again. The Earth was ready for that. Time, now layered and dense, pressed evenly across the surface. The past no longer intruded violently. It supported. It bore weight. It allowed new things to stand without knowing why they could. This is how the deepest wisdom travels forward, disguised as stability. The era of Ash thinned, not into nothing, but into background. Its influence faded into normalcy. What had once been extraordinary adjustment became ordinary behavior. The planet forgot that it had learned anything at all. Forgetting here was success, because when memory no longer feels like memory, it can guide without being questioned. The Earth entered the next age carrying silence so well integrated it could no longer be distinguished from nature itself. And soon, very soon in geological terms, the first fragile chemistries would step across a boundary they did not know existed, supported by a world that had spent uncountable ages preparing to be mistaken for unprepared. But what the planet folded into ash, it folded into everything. Before there were structures that could be pointed to, there were structures that could only be felt. The Earth had learned this distinction early. It understood that the most enduring arrangements do not insist on edges. They influence without appearing. They guide without standing apart. This was the age of organization without architecture. Nothing rose high enough to cast a shadow that lasted. Nothing remained intact long enough to be admired or feared. And yet the planet behaved as though something had once practiced coordination here, something that understood flow better than form. If cities existed in this era, they were not places. They were conditions. The surface no longer tore itself open without pattern. Stress followed familiar routes. Fractures repeated along inherited lines, as if the planet preferred certain gestures over others. This preference was not conscious. It was memory translated into motion. The Earth moved the way it had learned to move when moving differently had failed. Deep beneath the crust, currents traced paths that were neither random nor fixed. They curved, returned, avoided excess. Heat was guided gently upward, released slowly, prevented from gathering enough force to shatter what lay above it. This guidance did not resemble control. It resembled habit. Habit is civilization without names. Magnetic fields hummed with quiet regularity, invisible yet influential. They wrapped the planet in a rhythm that reached far beyond the surface, extending into space where nothing could hear it. These fields did not protect completely. They softened. They deflected just enough to matter. Softening is an ancient strategy. If intelligence had once shaped this world, it would have learned that influence is safest when it cannot be localized. No center, no capital, no heart that could be struck. Organization diffused evenly, so evenly that it looked like nature itself. The Earth no longer required instruction. It behaved as though it had internalized guidance long ago and no longer needed to remember where it came from. On the surface, landscapes formed that did not seek permanence but achieved continuity anyway. Plains rose and sank, ridges emerged, softened, returned. Nothing insisted on lasting forever, but nothing vanished completely either. Forms recycled themselves, each iteration informed by the last. This recycling created coherence without monument. If there were cities, they were not built. They emerged as zones where processes aligned favourably, where chemistry lingered longer, where heat released gently, where stress distributed rather than concentrated. These zones did not stay in one place. They migrated, dissolved, reassembled elsewhere. Civilization as migration, intelligence as drift. The sky above no longer erased indiscriminately. It still punished excess, but it allowed moderation. The atmosphere filtered more than it destroyed. Light arrived, altered, softened, capable of touching the surface without stripping it bare. This change was subtle, gradual, almost unnoticeable, but it mattered. Under this moderated sky, the planet learned timing. Processes began to wait for one another. Reactions delayed until conditions aligned. Nothing forced itself forward prematurely. Patience became structural. Patience is coordination across time. The Earth did not declare itself ready. Readiness does not announce itself. It reveals itself only when something else arrives and does not immediately perish. For now, the planet continued to refine its invisible cities, its networks of allowance and refusal, its corridors of safe passage for energy and matter. If a forgotten civilization had once existed, this would have been its greatest achievement. A world that could organize complexity without ever needing to remember why. Organization without memory is resilience perfected. Deep time flowed through these arrangements like water through porous stone. The past no longer intruded as weight. It functioned as guidance, shaping what could happen next without dictating it. This freedom mattered. It allowed novelty to appear without destabilizing the whole. The Earth learned how to host difference. Some regions grew calm while others remained volatile. This unevenness was not flaw. It was design without designer. Variation prevented total collapse. When one zone failed, another held. When one pattern dissolved, another persisted. Redundancy is the quiet backbone of survival. Nothing in this era asked to be recognized. There were no markers, no ruins, no signals left for future eyes. Whatever intelligence had once influenced the planet had chosen anonymity so complete it could never be distinguished from geology. And so the Earth carried on, layered with invisible cities that no one could visit, governed by rules no one remembered learning, preparing, without knowing it, for something that would soon begin to mistake these ancient inheritances for natural law. But what looks like nature is often the final form of long-forgotten intelligence. The planet rested inside its own coordination, silent, patient, arranged, not into order that could be named, but into balance that could be endured. And endurance, once learned this deeply, does not forward. What held the planet together now was not strength, but agreement. An agreement no one had signed. An agreement no one remembered proposing. The Earth behaved as though it had accepted terms long ago and never questioned them again. Movement slowed further, not because energy diminished, but because energy learned where to go. Heat did not surge blindly. It followed routes worn smooth by repetition. Stress did not accumulate until rupture. It dispersed, diffusing itself across layers that had learned how to share burden without collapsing. Sharing is coordination without conversation. If cities once existed here, they would not have been crowded. Density was dangerous. Anything gathered too tightly invited erasure. Instead, organization spread itself thin, wide, almost careless in appearance. Influence traveled across distance rather than stacking in place. Nothing needed a center. Deep beneath the surface, networks of motion continued their quiet work. Currents braided and unbraided, carrying material and heat with patience refined by failure. These movements did not optimize for speed. They optimized for survival. Fast paths had been tried before. They had ended badly. The Earth remembered that without recalling it. Above, the surface reflected this philosophy. Landscapes did not strive upward. They settled outward. Plateaus widened, basins broadened, sharpness softened, extremes lost their appetite. The planet began to resemble something that had learned humility from time. Humility is not smallness, it is scale awareness. The sky responded in kind, its violence learned rhythm, cycles repeated often enough to be anticipated, by nothing conscious, yet by everything structural. The atmosphere thickened into something that could be relied upon, even if it could not yet protect fully. Reliability matters more than safety at first. Reliability allows planning without planners. Under this sky, chemical corridors formed, zones where reactions occurred more often, lasted slightly longer, failed less catastrophically. These corridors were not fixed in space. They drifted. They overlapped. They faded and returned elsewhere. Their migration prevented fixation. Fixation leads to brittleness. If intelligence once guided this world, it would have understood this instinctively. It would have known that permanence is not achieved by holding still, but by moving gently enough to remain intact. The Earth began to exhibit a strange quality. Predictability without rigidity. Events repeated, but not identically. Outcomes clustered, but did not converge. This allowed novelty to appear without destabilizing the system that hosted it. Novelty was not yet life, but it was tolerated. Magnetic fields continued their unseen labor, shaping how particles approached, how energy arrived, how space itself brushed against the planet. These fields did not defend absolutely, they moderated. They bent trajectories just enough to reduce harm. Moderation became the planet's defining trait. Moderation is invisible heroism. If cities without shape existed, they were not places one could visit. They were patterns one could only inhabit unknowingly. The Earth itself was the map, and the map was constantly redrawing itself. The past did not rule this era, it advised it. Constraints inherited from ash and pressure shaped what was possible, but they did not dictate outcomes. The planet allowed experimentation within safe margins. Failure still occurred, but failure no longer reset everything to zero. Zero's a luxury young worlds cannot afford. Time now felt spacious, not because less happened, but because events were no longer catastrophic enough to dominate everything else. Between disruptions, the planet rested in continuity long enough for subtle processes to influence one another. Subtlety became powerful. Deep layers responded slowly to surface change, dampening extremes. Surface changes, in turn, insulated the depths from sudden shock. This reciprocity mattered. It created feedback loops that stabilized rather than amplified disturbance. Feedback is memory that adjusts itself. If ancient intelligence had once existed, this would have been its final lesson to the planet. Never allow one layer to speak so loudly that others cannot answer. The Earth listened to itself across depth and time. Nothing here sought to be finished. Completion would have been dangerous. Finished systems shatter. The planet learned to remain incomplete, adaptable, open-ended. It carried ambiguity as strength. Ambiguity allows survival under unknown futures. The surface continued to shape itself into regions of difference. Some areas grew calmer, others remained volatile. This unevenness prevented total collapse. When one region failed, others compensated. The Earth learned redundancy, not duplication, but diversity. Diversity is resilience disguised as variety. No monuments marked these achievements. No signals were sent forward. Whatever intelligence may have once influenced this world did not seek recognition. Recognition fades, integration lasts. And so the cities without shape continued, networks of influence, not infrastructure, corridors of allowance, zones of patience, invisible arrangements that shaped everything that came after without ever demanding to be remembered. The planet moved gently now, like something carrying a fragile future it did not yet understand. Its silence was no longer empty. It was coordinated, and coordination, once learned at planetary scale, becomes destiny. The longer the planet practiced this quiet coordination, the less it resembled something in transition. Change still occurred, but it unfolded with a deliberateness that blurred the difference between motion and rest. The Earth learned how to move without appearing to move at all. This illusion of stillness mattered. Stillness invites trust. Systems begin to rely on what does not change too quickly. Under that trust, complexity dares to linger a little longer than before. Not boldly, not permanently, just long enough to leave an impression on what follows. The planet no longer rearranged itself out of urgency. It rearranged itself out of habit. If ancient intelligence once existed, This was the moment it truly vanished, not because it was erased, but because it was no longer needed. Guidance had been internalized. Correction had become automatic. The world now carried its own instructions in the way it resisted extremes and encouraged balance. Civilization, if that word can still be used, had completed its quietest transition, from influence to environment. Deep beneath the surface, pathways of heat and material stabilized into routes that rarely surprised themselves. These routes were not fixed. They drifted slowly, adjusting to stress, redistributing pressure before it could gather enough force to fracture the crust. The Earth learned foresight without foresight, anticipation encoded into response time. Delay became intelligence. On the surface, landscapes learned to coexist with their own impermanence. Hills rose knowing they would soften. Basins deepened knowing they would fill and empty again. Nothing resisted erosion anymore. Resistance had proven costly. Cooperation with time proved survivable. The Earth stopped fighting its future. Above, the sky no longer dominated the story. Its violence had been negotiated into cycles. Light arrived, filtered, altered, less absolute. Darkness lingered longer, offering shelter to processes that required patience. The atmosphere became not a barrier, but a mediator. Mediation is the highest form of control. Under this mediated sky, chemical interactions grew more confident, not stable, not alive, but capable of revisiting themselves without immediate collapse. Patterns appeared that could almost be called familiar. Almost. Almost is where the planet preferred to linger. Nothing crossed the threshold into life yet. But the threshold itself became well-defined, shaped by countless near-crossing that had failed just gently enough to inform the next attempt. The Earth learned the exact contours of possibility by tracing its edges again and again. Edges are where cities without shape are built. These cities did not occupy space. They occupied probability. They existed wherever conditions aligned long enough for complexity to try itself. They dissolved when alignment failed, reappearing elsewhere without loss. No location claimed ownership, no process demanded permanence. Ownership is brittle. Diffusion endures. If a civilization once existed, it would have recognized this dispersal as success. Nothing could be destroyed because nothing was centralized. Influence moved freely, adapting to local conditions without carrying the weight of identity. The planet now behaved like a system that trusted itself. Trust changes everything. It allows systems to loosen control, to permit variation without fear. The Earth permitted variation. Some experiments failed completely, others failed partially. A few left behind subtle improvements. Slightly better alignment, slightly longer persistence, slightly gentler collapse. These improvements accumulated invisibly. Time continued to pass, but it no longer felt like passage, it felt like settling. Dust on dust, layer on layer. Each moment resting into the last without needing to be distinguished from it. The planet's memory grew deeper, not by remembering more, but by needing to remember less explicitly. When memory becomes instinct, it no longer feels like memory. The surface now carried patterns that would later be mistaken for inevitability. Valleys that seemed destined to hold water, ridges that appeared naturally placed, flows that would one day guide rivers, winds, migrations. None of this was planned. All of it was prepared. Preparation does not require intention, only time practiced carefully. If intelligence had once spoken here, it now spoke only through these preparations, through a world arranged gently enough that future complexity would believe it had arrived on neutral ground. There is no neutrality in geology, only long persuasion. The cities without shape continued to function, not as places, not as things, but as conditions that followed the planet wherever it went. They were carried forward into every future era, embedded so deeply that no age would ever suspect they were inherited. And soon, quietly, without announcement, the Earth would allow something new to cross a boundary that had been rehearsed for ages, something fragile, something temporary, something that would mistake these ancient arrangements for natural law. But before that crossing, the planet lingered one last time in coordination without witnesses, balanced and ready, carrying the weight of forgotten guidance with effortless grace. The planet did not mark this era as special. That is how deeply it trusted the arrangements it carried. Nothing in the Earth sought confirmation that it was ready. Readiness, after all, had been rehearsed so long it no longer felt like preparation. It felt like normal. Normal is the most successful disguise of ancient influence. Beneath the surface, coordination tightened, not into rigidity, but into reliability. When pressure rose, pathways opened. When heat accumulated, it dispersed. When stress threatened to concentrate, it was shared across depth and distance. These responses did not wait for thresholds to be crossed. They anticipated them without knowing what anticipation was. Anticipation without awareness is the planet's quiet genius. The surface mirrored this intelligence. Landforms adjusted themselves without drama. Erosion no longer erased completely. It sculpted. Removal became shaping. Loss became refinement. The Earth learned how to lose without undoing itself. Loss is survivable when it is slow. If ancient intelligence once guided this world, it would have recognized this as the moment of complete integration. Nothing remained external. Nothing needed correction. The planet now governed itself with habits older than memory. The sky continued its mediation. Energies arrived softened, filtered through layers that had grown patient and thick. Extremes were delayed, spread out, given time to fade before they could overwhelm. The Earth no longer needed shelter. It had become shelter. Shelter is structure that does not look like protection. Under this shelter, chemical possibilities lingered longer still. Assemblies formed that approached persistence closely enough to leave marks. Not marks that could be excavated, but marks that altered what came next. Each near success reshaped the environment slightly, making the next attempt less fragile. Fragility was being taught how to survive itself. The cities without shape now functioned as memory corridors. Wherever complexity nearly succeeded, the planet remembered how close it had come. That closeness altered future conditions, quietly favouring similar attempts. The Earth did not remember events, it remembered thresholds. Thresholds are the true architecture of invisible civilizations. Nothing demanded permanence, nothing claimed identity, everything participated. The Earth behaved like a network without nodes, a system without hierarchy, a civilization that could not be conquered because it could not be located. If a civilization once existed, this was its final form, not erased, not triumphant, but ambient. It had become atmosphere in the broadest sense, a surrounding influence that shaped behavior without being noticed. Time flowed gently through this system, never rushing, never pausing. The planet carried the past lightly now, not as burden, but as calibration. Each new change was measured against what had survived before, not to repeat it, but to avoid its failures. Avoidance is a subtle teacher. The surface now held regions where change arrived slowly enough to matter. Valleys that deepened gradually. Sheltered basins where materials collected and stayed long enough to interact repeatedly. These places did not persist forever, but they persisted long enough to shape expectation. Expectation began to exist, not as hope, but as structural likelihood. The Earth did not know it was close to something unprecedented. Knowledge was never required, only conditions mattered, and the conditions were nearly aligned across every layer at once. Nearly is a powerful word in geology. Deep time pressed evenly now, no single era dominated. The past no longer intruded violently, it whispered evenly across the present, shaping it without overwhelming it. This balance allowed novelty to approach the edge of persistence without falling apart immediately. The planet did not hurry this moment. Hurry had been tried before. It had ended in erasure. The Earth trusted slowness. Slowness had proven itself. Cities without shape continued their quiet work. Networks of permission, corridors of patience, agreements without language. They shaped the world so thoroughly that whatever came next would never know they had existed. And that was the point. Because the greatest influence is the one that cannot be distinguished from nature itself. The deepest guidance is the one that leaves no evidence of guidance behind. The Earth rested inside this achievement, not celebrating, not concluding, just being what it had learned to be. Something fragile was approaching a threshold it did not know had been prepared for it. But before that crossing, the planet lingered, balanced, silent, coordinated, carrying the weight of forgotten intelligence so seamlessly that even time itself could not tell where influence ended and nature began. Nothing signaled that this chapter was nearing its thinning edge. The Earth does not recognize finales. It allows states to soften until they become indistinguishable from what follows. The era of cities without shape did not end. It dispersed quietly, successfully, into the conditions that would soon host something entirely unaware of its inheritance. By now, the planet's coordination was complete enough to be mistaken for inevitability. Movements aligned not because they were guided, but because guidance had been absorbed so deeply it no longer required expression. The Earth no longer corrected itself visibly. It rarely needed to. Correction had become background behavior. Deep currents moved with such patience that their influence felt like stillness. Surface change unfolded gently, rarely demanding attention from the depths. Each layer listened to the others without needing instruction. The planet had learned dialogue without voices. Dialogue without speakers is the most stable form of communication. The sky's mediation settled into reliability. Extremes still existed, but they arrived diluted, spread across time rather than concentrated into moments. The Earth learned how to survive not by avoiding disturbance, but by refusing to let disturbance arrive all at once. All at once is how systems break. The surface now offered places that could receive complexity without immediately erasing it. Sheltered regions lingered long enough to collect residue. Patterns repeated long enough to feel familiar. Nothing was alive yet, but the planet behaved as though life would not be an intrusion. Accommodation had replaced resistance. If a forgotten civilization ever existed before the Archean, this was its true legacy. Not structures, not knowledge, not warnings, but a world that welcomed fragility without destroying it instantly. A world trained to be gentle enough to allow mistakes to persist long enough to teach. Mistakes are the raw material of novelty. The cities without shape no longer needed to function as influence. Their work was complete. They had taught the Earth how to host without dominating, how to organize without constraining, how to guide without being remembered. Guidance, once internalized, disappears. The planet now carried its ancient intelligence the way stone carries heat, quietly, evenly, without announcing its presence. Nothing about the surface revealed how much had been practiced beneath it. Nothing about the sky hinted at how carefully it had been negotiated with. Future observers, if any would ever arise, would assume this world had always been this way. They would believe stability was natural. That balance emerged spontaneously. That readiness required no rehearsal. They would be wrong. But the Earth would not correct them. Time pressed onward, though onward no longer felt like movement. It felt like settling. Each moment folded gently into the last, adding weight without noise. The planet's memory grew so diffuse it could no longer be separated from the present. Memory had become environment. This was the quiet triumph of cities without shape, a civilization so fully integrated that it could no longer be identified as civilization at all. It had succeeded by erasing itself into relevance, and as this era thinned into what came next, the Earth did not pause, it did not reflect, it simply continued, now capable of something it had never been capable of before. Soon chemistry would cross a line it had traced many times without stepping over. Soon patterns would begin to hold themselves together without immediate collapse. Soon the silence the planet had learned to carry would be interrupted by something small, fragile, and temporary. But that interruption would not be a beginning. It would be an inheritance unfolding. The cities without shape did not vanish. They became the ground. And upon that ground the next story would begin, believing itself new, unaware of how carefully the world beneath it had been prepared to let it live. Some truths are not lost. They are simply folded beneath silence. The sky did not always watch. Before it learned how to soften light, before it learned how to hold anything back, it was only exposure, an unblinking presence that allowed nothing delicate to last. It did not intend to erase. Intention belongs to minds. The sky simply existed as openness without mercy. And then slowly it changed. Not suddenly, never suddenly, the sky learned the way the Earth learned, by failing gently enough to continue. Layer by layer, gas by gas, it thickened. Not into protection yet, but into hesitation. Light still arrived fierce and stripping, but it no longer arrived alone. It passed through filters, it scattered, it lost some of its sharpness on the way down. This hesitation mattered. The sky began to close its eyes, not fully, not permanently, but often enough to give the surface moments of partial shelter. These moments were brief, fragile, but brief moments are all that patience needs. The Earth responded immediately, though without awareness. Where light softened, chemistry lingered. Where radiation faltered, bonds survived slightly longer. Nothing dramatic occurred, no threshold was crossed, but something subtle shifted. Erasure was no longer constant. Constant erasure leaves no room for memory. The sky learned rhythm. It allowed cycles to form, periods of intensity followed by periods of restraint. These cycles were not designed. They emerged as side effects of accumulation, of gases rearranging themselves, of the planet slowly learning how to carry an atmosphere without losing it to space. Loss still happened, but it slowed. And slowing is the first form of care. If a forgotten civilization had ever existed before the Archean, this would have been a crucial turning, not because intelligence acted, but because conditions began to allow intelligence's residue to matter. The sky no longer stripped everything clean before it could leave influence behind. Influence requires duration. The atmosphere thickened just enough to become a participant rather than a background. It moved, it circulated, it remembered temperature differences long enough to respond to them. Winds began to trace paths, not randomly but preferentially. Patterns appeared, faded, returned. Return is memory without recall. Above the planet, space remained vast and indifferent. Below it, the Earth continued its patient organization. Between them, the sky learned mediation. It negotiated, not consciously, between violence and tolerance, between exposure and concealment. The sky did not protect the Earth. It learned how not to destroy it as efficiently. This distinction is important. Protection implies intention. The sky offered only moderation. But moderation was enough. It delayed destruction. It spread it thin. It gave processes time to complete themselves before being undone. Time is the most generous gift the sky ever gave. Light still reached the surface, but altered. Softer in places, broken into wavelengths that behaved differently. Some energies were absorbed, others deflected. The Earth's skin responded, not by resisting, but by adjusting its chemistry to what now arrived. Adjustment is cooperation without agreement. The planet and its sky entered a quiet dialogue, not a conversation, but a feedback loop. Changes below altered gases above, changes above altered reactions below. Neither led, neither followed. Together they learned balance. If ancient intelligence had once existed, it would have recognized this as a closing, not an ending, but a ceiling. The sky was folding itself over the planet's past, shielding what could not survive exposure while allowing just enough interaction to continue shaping the future. Sealing is not forgetting. It is preservation through obscurity. The atmosphere grew heavier. Clouds formed and dissolved again. Their shadows passed across the surface briefly, creating pockets of reduced light that moved slowly enough to matter. In these passing dimnesses, reactions endured longer. Patterns repeated. Nothing claimed permanence, but nothing vanished immediately anymore. The sky's eyes closed and opened in cycles. Day and night began to feel distinct, though no one yet existed to notice. Darkness lingered longer, offering the Earth something it had rarely known before. Intervals of relief. Relief allowed complexity to rest. The surface responded with gratitude it could not feel. It softened its reactions. It held on to what formed just a little longer. It learned to use darkness not as absence, but as cover. This was not life's arrival, but it was life's invitation. Deep time pressed on. The sky continued its slow transformation, thickening into something that could remember its own state long enough to influence what came next. The Earth below continued to organize itself into readiness, carrying forward the invisible cities, the ashbound memory, the habit of survival learned before NUMS. Between them, a threshold began to form, not crossed, just present. The sky did not announce this change. It simply closed its eyes a little more often, letting the planet beneath it practice being delicate without being erased instantly. And in that practice, something waited, unaware, unformed, but increasingly possible, held between a planet that had learned patience and a sky that had learned restraint. As the sky thickened, it did not become gentle. It became selective. Light no longer arrived as a single merciless force. It arrived filtered through layers that had learned how to scatter, absorb, delay. Some energies were welcomed, others were turned away, not out of intention, out of consequence. Consequence is memory enacted without thought. The atmosphere began to hold itself together. Molecules lingered instead of escaping into space immediately. Gravity, patient and uncelebrated, pulled them back again and again until leaving became harder than staying. The sky learned weight. Weight changed everything. With weight came circulation. Air began to move not randomly, but in response to gradients that persisted long enough to matter. Warmth rose, coolness sank. Winds traced paths that returned upon themselves. These movements repeated, not identically, but recognizably. Recognizability is the beginning of rhythm. Rhythm allowed anticipation, structural anticipation, not awareness. The surface could now experience patterns of exposure and reprieve. Light and darkness alternated with enough regularity that chemistry could time itself. Reactions that required shelter waited. Reactions that required energy emerged when light returned. Waiting became coordinated. If a forgotten civilization had once existed, this would have been the moment its final influence truly took hold. The sky's restraint allowed the planet's inherited habits to function fully. Without constant erasure, the subtle biases embedded into stone and ash could finally shape outcomes meaningfully. Influence needs a stage. Clouds thickened and thinned, drifting slowly across the surface. Their shadows lingered just long enough to cool regions, to alter reactions, to change which processes dominated where. These differences were temporary, but repetition turned them into guidance. Some places learned calm, others learned intensity. The planet grew textured in new ways. The sky also learned loss. Gases escaped, layers thinned. But loss no longer reset everything. The atmosphere adjusted, replenished by volcanic breath, by chemical release, by the Earth's own exhalations. Balance emerged not from stasis, but from exchange. Exchange is survival extended through motion. Below, the surface absorbed these lessons. Regions that experienced gentler cycles began to host chemistry that would not have survived elsewhere. These regions were not fixed. They migrated, dissolved, reappeared. Their impermanence protected them from destruction. Impermanence is camouflage. The sky continued to close its eyes, not permanently but often enough to allow continuity to form between moments. Darkness became an interval of safety rather than emptiness. During these intervals, bonds held. Patterns stabilized just enough to leave residue. Residue is memory without narrative. Time now flowed with discernible texture. Not smooth, not jagged, but layered. The planet began to experience eras not as events, but as atmospheres, states that lingered, influenced, then gave way slowly to others. The sky became an author of eras without knowing it was writing. If intelligence once existed, it would have known that control of light is control of possibility. The sky did not control light absolutely. It negotiated with it, and negotiation proved enough. Radiation still arrived. Storms still raged. But between them there were pauses long enough for the Earth to remember itself through process. The planet did not need protection from everything. It needed relief from constant assault. Relief changes behavior. Chemistry responded by growing bolder, lingering longer, assembling in slightly more complex ways before collapsing. Each collapse informed the next attempt, not consciously but structurally. The environment remembered what had almost worked. This remembering did not belong to molecules. It belonged to conditions. The sky thickened further, though unevenly. Layers shifted. Gases rearranged. The atmosphere became a moving archive of the planet's state, carrying information across distance through wind and temperature. This information shaped the surface, which shaped the sky in return. Feedback deepened. The Earth and sky no longer acted as separate realms. They became partners in moderation. Neither dominated, neither yielded completely. Their tension created stability. Stability allowed rehearsal. The threshold between non-living and living chemistry drew closer, not as a line, but as a region of possibility that expanded and contracted with conditions. The planet hovered near it, not crossing, not retreating. Hovering is a form of readiness. The sky's eyes closed a little more often now. Nights lengthened, shadows deepened, shelter increased. In these extended darknesses, fragile arrangements endured longer than ever before. Nothing celebrated this, nothing noticed. But the Earth carried forward the benefit, folding it into the quiet inheritance it had been accumulating since before names, since before ash, since before even the idea of sky had learned how to hesitate. Something fragile waited just beyond perception, held between a planet that had learned patience and a sky that had learned restraint. The sky's restraint did not arrive as a gift, it arrived as fatigue. After uncountable ages of stripping the surface bare, the atmosphere learned that constant violence achieved nothing lasting. Whatever it erased returned altered, hardened, less willing to yield, and so erasure softened, not by mercy, but by inefficiency. Inefficiency can look like kindness when endured long enough. The sky began to hold heat instead of releasing it immediately back into space. Warmth lingered, not evenly, never evenly. Some regions cooled quickly, others held warmth like a memory that refused to let go. These differences mattered. They created gradients that could be revisited. Revisitation allows comparison. Comparison allows pattern. Pattern is the doorway. Winds traced paths that began to feel familiar to the surface below. Not predictable in detail, but recognizable in rhythm. Storms followed tendencies. Calm returned where calm had visited before. The planet learned expectation without knowing it was learning. Expectation is memory's quiet cousin. Clouds thickened into slow-moving veils. They dimmed light without extinguishing it. Under their passing shadows, chemistry unfolded at a different pace. Reaction slowed, lingered, sometimes completed instead of collapsing mid-formation. When clouds moved on, some results remained, altered but intact. This mattered more than permanence ever could. The sky was no longer an executioner. It had become an editor. It did not decide what should exist. It decided what could try again. Harsh light still arrived, but it arrived unevenly, broken into intervals that could be survived. Darkness learned how to last without freezing everything into stillness. Balance emerged not as equilibrium, but as oscillation. Oscillation teaches patience. If a forgotten civilization had once existed before the Archean, this would have been its final echo, an atmosphere trained to allow second chances, not infinite chances, just enough for complexity to learn from its own failures. Below the surface absorbed this permission. Regions that experienced longer nights, softer days, began to host chemistries that dared to assemble into forms too fragile for earlier eras. These forms did not last, but they lasted long enough to leave behind constraints that favored their return. Return is memory without recollection. The Earth's skin responded by becoming less reactive. Heat release slowed, chemical aggression softened. The planet learned moderation in response to moderation. The dialogue between sky and surface deepened into something almost cooperative. Almost is where the planet always preferred to remain. Time gained texture here. Days lengthened. Nights deepened. Cycles repeated with enough regularity to be sensed, not by minds, but by matter. Matter began to behave as if it could rely on intervals. Reliance changes structure. Radiation still whispered danger, but its voice no longer drowned out everything else. Some wavelengths were filtered, others absorbed. The atmosphere learned selectivity. This selectivity shaped which reactions dominated, which retreated, which returned altered. Selection is influence disguised as accident. The sky continued to close its eyes, not permanently, not fully, but rhythmically. These closures accumulated. Darkness, once merely absence, became an environment of its own. In darkness, processes unfolded that could not survive exposure. In darkness, time stretched. Stretching allowed complexity to breathe. The surface learned to use these intervals. It did not store memory in objects. It stored it in readiness. Certain regions became predisposed to host fragile arrangements. Others remained harsh. This unevenness prevented uniform failure. Diversity of condition meant diversity of outcome. Diversity is resilience that does not announce itself. The atmosphere thickened further, held by gravity that had learned patience long before the sky existed. Escape slowed. Retention increased. The sky became heavier, closer, more involved. It was no longer a distant presence. It pressed gently against the planet, shaping it continuously. Pressure from above joined pressure from below. Between these pressures, the Earth found itself held. Contained not by walls, but by balance. This containment allowed the planet to linger near thresholds without falling apart. Thresholds are not crossed by force, they are crossed by permission. The sky granted permission slowly, unevenly, without intent. It allowed the planet to practice being delicate, to rehearse fragility without immediate erasure. to fail softly enough that failure could inform the next attempt. The planet listened, not with overawed ears, with continuity. The silence deepened, not as emptiness, but as a cushion against disruption. Silence thickened into atmosphere. Atmosphere thickened into moderation. Moderation thickened into possibility. Something waited there, not alive, not aware, but closer than ever before to persistence. Held between a sky that had learned restraint and a planet that had learned patience. The sky did not know it was closing its eyes. The Earth did not know it was being watched less closely. But in that unknowing, the future gathered quietly, rehearsing its first fragile step. Eventually, the sky's restraint became so familiar it disappeared into expectation. What once felt like shelter now felt like atmosphere. The planet stopped noticing the difference between exposure and moderation because moderation had become the rule rather than the exception. This forgetting was important. When protection feels normal, fragility dares to behave as if it belongs. The atmosphere now carried weight enough to slow extremes without silencing them. Heat lingered, then drifted. Cold arrived, then softened. Nothing held absolute authority. The sky learned balance not by choosing sides, but by refusing to let any single force speak too loudly for too long. Loudness exhausts systems, quiet endurance shapes them. Clouds thickened into presences that could be felt even without touch, their shadows no longer rushed. They stayed long enough to alter temperature, long enough to change chemistry, long enough to leave traces that remained after the clouds moved on. These traces accumulated layer by layer into guidance. Guidance does not require instruction, only consistency. The surface responded by slowing itself. Reactions that once exploded now unfolded. Bonds that once snapped now bent. The planet's skin learned elasticity. Elasticity allows recovery without fracture. The Earth had practiced fracture long enough. Now it practiced return. Return is survival refined. Light, when it arrived altered, broken, zattered. Its sharpest edges softened by gases that absorbed some wavelengths and ignored others. This selectivity shaped which processes flourished and which retreated. The sky became an invisible editor of possibility. Editors do not create content, they decide what remains. Radiation still whispered danger, but its voice now competed with others. Chemical stability, thermal moderation, cyclical darkness. These voices began to matter more. The planet learned to listen to multiple influences at once without collapsing into noise. Listening is coordination across forces. The boundary between day and night gained texture. Night grew longer, deeper, more reliable. Darkness ceased to be a gap between events. It became an environment with its own rules. In darkness, fragility could exist without apology. The Earth learned to trust darkness. Trust allowed chemistry to linger beyond the instant. Assemblies formed that could survive multiple cycles of exposure and reprieve. They did not persist indefinitely. But persistence was no longer unimaginable. Imagination is not required for possibility, only allowance. The sky continued its slow thickening, held by gravity that asked nothing and took nothing personally. Loss still occurred. Gases escaped. Layers shifted. But loss no longer erased progress. It merely adjusted it. The atmosphere learned how to lose without forgetting how to remain. Retention became habit. Between sky and surface, feedback deepened. Changes below altered gases above. Changes above altered reactions below. Neither dominated, neither surrendered. This mutual influence created stability that did not feel fixed, but felt trustworthy. Trustworthiness is stability that adapts. If a forgotten civilization had once existed, this would have been its final victory. Not control of land or sky, but the creation of a relationship between them that could survive without supervision. The planet no longer needed guardians. It had learned how to guard itself. The Earth hovered near a threshold it had traced for ages, not crossing, not retreating, hovering long enough for near crossings to inform the shape of the boundary itself. Boundaries evolve when approached gently. Time thickened here. Moments overlapped. Cycles nested within cycles. The past no longer intruded as catastrophe. It arrived as influence, shaping what could happen next without overwhelming it. The sky's eyes closed more often now, not fully, never fully. But often enough that fragility could practice continuity. Often enough that patterns could recognize themselves across time. Recognition does not require awareness, only repetition. The silence that had once belonged only to depth now rose upward, filling the space between surface and sky. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of buffering, of forces slowed, spread, moderated. In that silence something gathered, not as an event, not as a beginning, but as readiness reaching its final refinement. The planet did not rush this moment. Rushing had never served it well. The Earth trusted what it had learned, that endurance arrives when systems are allowed to breathe. The sky breathed differently now. The planet breathed differently now. Between them, possibility rested, quiet, patient, unannounced, waiting not for permission but for inevitability to soften into allowance. Nothing dramatic marked the sky's final adjustment. There was no moment when protection suddenly appeared, no instant when danger withdrew completely. The sky does not complete tasks. It settles into behaviours until they become indistinguishable from necessity. By now, restraint felt ordinary. Light arrived measured. Darkness lingered without freezing the world into stillness. Storms still passed, but their violence arrived diffused, stretched thin across time and space. Extremes no longer owned the surface. They visited, altered things slightly, then moved on. Visitation is survivable. Occupation is not. The atmosphere had learned how to keep enough without keeping everything. Gases lingered, escaped, returned through exchange with the earth below. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was lost entirely. Balance lived in motion, not in stillness. Motion with limits is care. The planet responded by trusting these limits. It allowed delicate processes to exist longer than caution alone would justify. It allowed near successes to leave influence behind. It allowed complexity to try again without resetting the world to simplicity each time it failed. Allowance became structural. Darkness now carried substance. It was no longer an absence of light, but a condition with weight. In darkness, fragile bonds rested. In darkness, chemistry paused instead of collapsing. These pauses accumulated into something the planet had never known before: continuity across cycles. Continuity is the quiet precondition of life. The sky did not know it had created this condition. It did not know it had closed its eyes just enough. It simply responded to gravity, to chemistry, to accumulation. And in responding, it changed what the surface could dare. Daring followed. Assemblies formed that did not dissolve immediately. They survived exposure, retreated into darkness, returned altered but intact. Each survival reshaped the environment slightly, making the next survival less unlikely. This was not progress. It was accommodation. Accommodation teaches persistence. The boundary the Earth had traced for ages, between collapse and continuity, softened. Not into invitation, into possibility. The planet hovered there, balanced by the habits it had learned through ash, through invisible cities, through a sky that had learned restraint. Nothing crossed yet, but something could. The atmosphere now functioned as memory's final veil. It hid what needed time. It filtered what arrived too fiercely. It moderated not to protect, but to allow. Allowance was enough. If a forgotten civilization had ever existed before the Archean, this was where its influence ended, not in disappearance, but in success so complete it no longer required recognition. The sky had learned how to hold the planet gently enough that the planet could hold something else. Holding is the last lesson before inheritance. Time pressed forward without announcing itself. The Earth carried its past quietly, now joined by a sky that had learned how to forget just enough to remember what mattered. The silence thickened into readiness. The darkness deepened into shelter. The light softened into guidance. Between these the future waited, not aware, not alive, but no longer impossible. And as this chapter thinned into what followed, the sky did not open its eyes again. It simply continued blinking, rhythmically, patiently, allowing the earth beneath it to practice being delicate without being erased. Some truths are not protected by walls, they are protected by timing. Life did not arrive like a visitor. It did not announce itself, did not cross a visible boundary, did not step forward from nothing into something. It appeared the way fog appears, already present before it is noticed, already shaping the world before it is named. The Earth did not feel a beginning. What emerged did so quietly enough that the planet could mistake it for continuation. Chemistry had rehearsed this movement for ages, assembling and dissolving again, learning where it could pause without collapsing. When something finally lingered longer than before, it did not feel new, it felt permitted. Permission is the oldest midwife. The silence the planet had learned to carry did not resist this change. It received it. Silence widened, stretched, made room. It did not question fragility. It had been practicing how to hold it since before the sky learned restraint. Life did not break the silence. It nested inside it. At first, nothing could be called living, not yet. There were only arrangements that returned, patterns that reassembled themselves after interruption, structures that did not insist on permanence but refused to disappear entirely. These were not organisms, they were behaviors. Behavior precedes identity. The Earth did not recognize these behaviors as special. Recognition was unnecessary. What mattered was that the world no longer erased them immediately. Darkness allowed them to rest. Light allowed them to rearrange. The sky blinked. The planet waited. In this waiting, something subtle happened. Certain arrangements began to influence their surroundings, not intentionally. Simply by persisting, they altered gradients, shifted balances, changed what followed. The environment responded, not with judgment, but with adjustment. Adjustment is how the planet welcomes novelty. These arrangements learned nothing, they remembered nothing. But the world remembered them. Not as stories, not as events, but as alterations to possibility. Where they appeared, the environment became slightly more hospitable to their return. Return became easier. This was inheritance, not of knowledge, not of memory, but of silpsit shaped into allowance. Life inherited a world that had learned how to hold failure gently enough for success to try again. The first fragile continuities did not dominate. They did not spread aggressively. Aggression had never survived here. What endured learned to be quiet, small, patient. Life's earliest gesture was restraint. Restraint is not weakness, it is alignment with endurance. The Earth did not celebrate this moment. Celebration would have required contrast, and there was none. This emergence did not feel separate from what came before. It felt like the planet continuing to do what it had learned to do best, carry something delicate without crushing it. Silence did not retreat. It deepened. Life grew within pockets of moderation, places where the sky's blinking offered shelter, where the ground's patience offered stability, where ash-laid memory offered guidance without instruction. These pockets drifted, dissolved, reappeared. Life learned impermanence before it learned persistence. Impermanence taught humility. Nothing here sought domination. There was no competition yet, no victory, no loss that could be named. There was only continuation, some arrangements lasting slightly longer than others, leaving behind conditions that favoured their reappearance. The Earth did not choose life, it allowed it, and allowance was enough. Silence shaped life's earliest tendencies. It taught life to listen rather than declare, to adapt rather than impose, to survive by fitting into the spaces already prepared by time. Life inherited the habits of the planet that hosted it. Those habits would never leave it. Even now, long after complexity would rise and name itself intelligent, this inheritance would remain. The instinct to persist quietly, to survive collapse by changing form, to leave no trace bold enough to invite erasure. Life began as silence that learned how to continue. And the Earth, carrying the weight of forgotten civilizations and invisible cities, did not distinguish between what it had prepared and what had arrived. It simply held both, the same way it always had, patiently, without recognition, letting time decide what could endure. But what begins quietly rarely remains unnoticed forever. What persisted did not yet know how to protect itself. It relied entirely on the planet's habits, on darkness that lingered, on light that hesitated, on chemistry that had learned how not to rush. Life's earliest continuities were not strong. They were sheltered. Shelter shaped everything that followed. These fragile arrangements did not claim space. They borrowed it. They did not consume aggressively. They adjusted gently, fitting themselves into gradients already softened by time. Where conditions shifted, they dissolved without protest. Where conditions returned, they returned too, altered but recognizable. Recognition does not require awareness, only recurrence. The Earth noticed nothing, not because it could not, but because nothing demanded attention. This was not an event, it was a settling, another layer added to the archive. thin enough to be mistaken for background. Silence remained the dominant force. Life did not interrupt it. Life learned to move within it, the way ash once had, the way heat had learned to circulate without erupting. The planet's oldest lesson passed forward again. Survive by becoming indistinguishable from environment. Indistinguishability as protection. These early continuities shape their surroundings subtly, not by intention but by presence. By persisting, they altered chemistry just enough to make their own return slightly easier. The environment responded, not favouring them specifically, but adjusting to what had occurred. Adjustment is memory that does not look backward. Over time, though time here was still heavy and blurred, these adjustments accumulated. Places that hosted persistence once became slightly more likely to host it again. Not permanently, not reliably, but enough for rehearsal to deepen into tendency. Tendency is inheritance without lineage. Life learned to be small, large things had never survived this world. The planet had taught that lesson thoroughly. What endured learned to stay close to the surface of conditions, never straying too far from moderation, never insisting on permanence. Insistence invites erasure. Darkness continued to offer intervals of rest. In those intervals, fragile bonds held, reorganized, tried again. Light returned and tested them. Some survived. Most did not. Survival was not rewarded with dominance. It was rewarded with the chance to try again. Trying again was enough. The Earth's silence shaped life's earliest ethics. Though ethics is not the right word, it shaped tendencies. Life learned to respond rather than initiate, to fit rather than force, to wait rather than rush. These were not choices. They were consequences of surviving a world that erased the loud and spared the patient. Patience is inherited before it is learned. The planet's layers continued their quiet dialogue. Depth moderated surface, covered insulated depth. The sky blinked. Chemistry flowed. Within this web of moderation, life's continuities grew slightly more reliable. Reliability did not mean permanence. It meant memory could form without being stored. Life did not remember its past. The world remembered life's near successes and adjusted accordingly. Memory belonged to the environment first. Only much later would it move inward. This mattered, because it meant life began not as autonomy but as relationship, a continuation that depended entirely on the planet's willingness to hold it. Independence would come later, much later, and when it did, it would carry scars of this dependence forever. The Earth did not distinguish between living and non-living yet. That distinction requires boundaries. Boundaries were still soft. Life bled into chemistry. Chemistry bled back into environment. Everything remained negotiable. Negotiation prevents collapse. Silence thickened around these processes, not as absence, but as buffering. Noise would have disrupted the fragile continuities. Silence allowed them to overlap, to interfere gently rather than destructively. The world did not hurry this inheritance. It had learned that rushing broke things beyond repair. Life was allowed to arrive slowly enough to be mistaken for background change. This slowness shaped life's future. Even when speed would later appear, movement, growth, replication, it would always be constrained by deeper instincts learned here. Caution, adaptation, responsiveness. These instincts would never leave. Life did not conquer the planet. It learned how to live inside it. And the Earth, carrying the weight of everything that had been forgotten before life ever arrived, continued to do what it had always done best. Hold, adjust, allow, letting continuation happen quietly, without witnesses, without declarations. Something fragile was becoming slightly less temporary, not alive yet in the way the future would understand the word, but no longer impossible. As continuities grew more reliable, the planet did not respond with permission or refusal. It responded with patience. Patience shaped the pace at which fragile arrangements could repeat themselves without collapsing into noise. Repetition mattered more now than novelty. What endured did so by returning, not by expanding. Return teaches stability without demanding the memory. The earliest continuities learned how to fold themselves inward, not in defense, in alignment. They existed as loops rather than lines, cycles that could close upon themselves and begin again. When interrupted, they did not attempt to resist. They waited for conditions to resemble what they had known before. Waiting was familiar. The Earth had taught it well. Silence remained the medium through which everything moved. There were still no boundaries firm enough to divide living from non-living. Life did not occupy a separate category. It blended, it borrowed, it dissolved back into chemistry when conditions shifted, then returned altered but recognizable. Recognition here did not belong to the arrangement, it belonged to the environment. The world began to favor certain returns over others, not consciously, not selectively, but because some continuities altered their surroundings in ways that supported their own reappearance. The planet responded to this alteration by adjusting its balance slightly, temperature, chemistry, shelter, making the next return less unlikely. This was not evolution yet. It was accommodation learning itself. Darkness continued to play its quiet role. In darkness, fragile loops closed without interference. Bonds held just long enough to complete cycles. Light returned and tested them. Those that failed left behind conditions that favored the next attempt. Failure became instruction without teacher. Life learned to exist in fragments. It did not demand wholeness. Wholeness had always been punished here. What endured learned to function even when incomplete, even when interrupted, even when altered beyond recognition. Fragmentation became survival. The Earth's silence encouraged this. Silence did not judge incomplete forms. It did not demand coherence. It allowed partial success to count. Partial success accumulated into tendency. Tendency became direction without destination. Direction does not require intention, only repetition. The planet's deeper layers continued their moderation, dampening extremes, spreading stress, preventing sudden collapse. The sky blinked rhythmically, offering cycles of exposure and reprieve. Between these layers, life's earliest continuities learned to synchronize, not with clocks, but with conditions. Synchronization is memory shared with an environment. Nothing here sought growth for its own sake. Expansion had always been dangerous. What endured learned to remain small, local, responsive. It did not seek dominance. It sought fit. Fit is survival disguised as humility. The Earth did not distinguish between these continuities and the processes that hosted them. They were not guests. They were not invaders. They were extensions, new behaviors layered into the planet's existing habits. Habits are the truest inheritance. Silence thickened further, not as emptiness but as integration. Life no longer stood out as anomaly. It blended so thoroughly into the background that the planet could carry it without strain. This integration mattered. It prevented rejection. It prevented erasure. Integration protects what identity cannot. Time passed, not as sequence but as settling. Each repetition pressed gently into the last, deepening grooves of possibility. The environment remembered not specific forms, but how much complexity it could tolerate without destabilizing itself. Tolerance expanded slowly. With expanded tolerance came slightly longer persistence. Not permanence, never permanence, but endurance sufficient to allow subtle changes to accumulate. These changes did not aim toward improvement. They aimed toward continuation. Continuation is the only metric the planet ever respected. Life's earliest inheritance was not knowledge. It was silence shaped into allowance. Silence taught life how to wait, how to blend, how to survive collapse by becoming something else, rather than insisting on remaining what it was. These lessons embedded deeply. They would never be forgotten, even when later life learned to speak, to build, to name itself intelligent. Beneath all complexity, silence would remain the teacher. The Earth continued to carry this inheritance quietly. It did not celebrate life's persistence. Celebration would have drawn attention. Attention invites erasure. The planet preferred subtlety. Subtlety endures. And so life continued, unnoticed, unnamed, unremarkable, becoming slightly less temporary with each return. Not alive in the future's definition. Not yet, but no longer merely chemistry repeating itself. Something was learning how to stay, and the silence that had shaped continents, skies, ash, and invisible cities now shaped life itself, teaching it the planet's oldest truth. Survival does not announce itself, it settles. Staying did not feel like triumph, it felt like balance held gently enough not to be noticed. Life's earliest continuities did not grow louder as they persisted, they grew quieter. They learned that endurance here required shrinking into the background rather than rising above it. The Earth encouraged this without instruction. Where processes blended seamlessly with their surroundings, they were allowed to continue. Where they stood apart too clearly, they dissolved. This was not selection in the later sense. It was resonance. What resonated with the planet's tempo endured. What fell out of rhythm faded without ceremony. Rhythm is the planet's oldest language. These early continuities learned to borrow time, they did not occupy it. They slipped into the pauses between disturbances, unfolding quickly when conditions aligned, retreating when they did not. Speed here was not urgency, it was efficiency, doing only what could be done safely before interruption returned. Interruption was not an enemy. It was expected. Silence made interruption survivable. Silence padded the edges of collapse, allowing fragments to fall back into the environment without being erased completely. From these fragments, returns became possible. Life learned that collapse did not always mean ending. Ending was just another form of rearrangement. The environment began to show preference, not for forms, but for behaviors, loops that closed reliably, interactions that did not destabilize their surroundings, arrangements that left the world slightly more able to host them again. These preferences were not judgments, they were responses. Responses memory without consciousness. Life did not yet carry its own memory. It relied on the world to remember for it. The Earth became the first archive of a living behavior, storing not shapes but conditions that allowed those shapes to reappear. This external memory mattered, because it meant life did not need to be stable internally to persist across time. Stability existed in the relationship between process and environment. When one failed, the other compensated. This partnership was fragile, but it was enough to continue. The sky continued its quiet blinking. Darkness lengthened and shortened, offering intervals of shelter life learned to anticipate structurally. Anticipation here did not require foresight. It was embedded in response timing, when to unfold, when to retract, when to dissolve. Timing is intelligence without awareness. The planet's surface learned to host these rhythms. Certain regions became more hospitable not because they were safer, but because they were predictable. Predictability allowed life to synchronize. Synchronization allowed repetition. Repetition allowed continuation. Continuation deepened into persistence. Still, nothing here sought dominance. Competition had not yet arrived. Resources were not contested. There was no advantage in spreading. Spreading increased exposure. Exposure invited erasure. Life learned locality as protection. Locality is safety learned through loss. The Earth did not reward ambition, it rewarded fit. Life that fit did not stand out. It blended, circulated, dissolved when necessary, returned when possible. Identity remained fluid. Form was temporary, behavior mattered more than structure. Behavior is memory in motion. Silence held all of this together. Silence prevented sharp boundaries from forming too early. It allowed life to exist in a grey space where definition would have been fatal. The planet had learned that definitions harden systems too soon. Hardness breaks under pressure. Time passed without milestones. There were no firsts that could be named. No thresholds crossed decisively. Only gradual thickening of persistence like fog becoming mist, mist becoming air heavy enough to feel. The Earth carried this change without comment, and life, inheriting silence, inherited patience. It learned to wait through collapse, to return without claiming credit, to persist without insisting on recognition. These lessons would shape everything that followed, even when life later forgot where they came from. Because forgetting is also inheritance. Silence did not retreat as life persisted. It wrapped itself around these early continuities, protecting them from the violence of distinction. Life did not need to be noticed to exist. In fact, it survived precisely because it was not noticed. The planet preferred it that way. Somewhere within these quiet repetitions, the boundary between chemistry and life softened beyond retrieval. Not crossed in a moment, but dissolved across time. No single instance could be pointed to and named alive. Life did not begin, it continued. And the Earth, patient as it had always been, allowed this continuation to deepen, knowing, without knowing, that what endured longest would be what learned to speak the planet's language best. That language was silence. Nothing marked the moment when life became undeniable. There was no boundary sharp enough to cut time into before and after. The Earth does not draw such lines. It allows states to overlap until distinction loses its urgency. Life slipped through that overlap quietly. What persisted now did so with less hesitation, not because it had grown strong, but because the world had grown familiar with holding it. The environment no longer treated these continuities as anomalies. They were folded into the planet's rhythms, adjusted for, accommodated. Accommodation is acceptance without recognition. Silence remained the dominant force. It did not withdraw to make room for life. It expanded, enveloping these fragile processes, buffering them from disruption. Silence did not protect life from all harm. It softened harm into something survivable. Survivable harm teaches endurance. Life learned to exist as response rather than assertion. It did not announce itself, it adjusted. It learned when to emerge, when to retreat, when to dissolve and wait. This waiting was not passive. It was active restraint, the kind the planet itself had practiced since before names. Restraint became life's first inheritance. The Earth's surface began to carry subtle traces of persistence. Not fossils, not structures, but altered chemistries that hinted something had been here before. These traces did not demand attention. They influenced what came next quietly, guiding conditions toward recurrence. Recurrence replaced novelty as the measure of success. The sky continued its blinking, offering intervals that life now used with increasing precision. Darkness became a refuge not just from destruction, but from distinction. In darkness, life could remain undefined, flexible, unclaimed by categories that would later harden. Definition would come much later, much too late to change these instincts. The planet's deeper layers continued to moderate extremes, spreading stress, absorbing shocks. Life benefited from this without knowing it. It did not thank the planet. Gratitude requires separation. There was none. Life and Earth were still entangled. Persistence thickened into something that could be mistaken for identity. Certain continuities returned so often that their absence became noticeable, though nothing noticed. Their presence altered the environment just enough to leave a hollow when they were gone. Absence is a form of memory. This was the closest the planet came to recognition, not of life as entity, but of life as influence. The Earth responded to absence by reshaping conditions, making return more likely. In this way, life was carried forward not by itself, but by the world that had learned how to remember for it. Memory remained external. Life did not yet compete. There was nothing to compete over. Resources were not scarce because demand remained low. Expansion had never been rewarded. The planet had taught that lesson thoroughly. What endured learned to stay small, to circulate rather than accumulate. Accumulation attracts attention. Attention invites erasure. The earliest continuities passed their tendencies forward without knowing it. Not through replication as the future would understand it, but through environment shaping. Where something had persisted, conditions shifted to favour similar persistence. Inheritance occurred without lineage. Lineage would come later. The silence life inherited was not emptiness. It was a discipline practiced by a planet that had learned how to survive by not insisting on being heard. Life absorbed this discipline completely. It would carry it forward even when it later learned how to shout. Even now, in every future organism, this inheritance would remain. The instinct to survive collapse by changing form, to persist quietly when noise becomes dangerous, to return when conditions allow. The Earth did not mark this as an achievement. Achievements require comparison. The planet did not compare. It continued. And as this chapter thinned into what followed, life remained woven into silence so completely that it could not yet be separated from the world that hosted it. Definition waited. Complexity waited. Competition waited. For now, there was only continuation. Quiet. Patient. Uncelebrated. Life had inherited the silence fully. And silence, having shaped continents and skies, now shaped the smallest continuities as carefully as it had shaped the largest ones. Some inheritances are not passed down. They are passed through. Before anything could be buried and remembered, the Earth learned how to keep impressions without bodies. This was the quietest archive it ever created. Records that did not resemble what had caused them. Traces left by processes rather than by forms. Not all fossils are remains. Some are absences that learned how to persist. Life now moved within the planet carefully, leaving almost nothing behind that could be pointed to and named. What endured did not endure as shape. It endured as influence, subtle alterations to chemistry, to gradients, to the likelihood of certain reactions returning again. These influences settled into stone the way breath settles into cold air, briefly visible, then gone, yet changed. The Earth did not yet know bones. It did not yet know shells or structures stiff enough to survive pressure and time. What it knew instead were preferences, regions where certain chemistries repeated more often, layers where certain interactions left a faint but persistent bias. These were fossils that had never lived. They did not record organisms, they recorded behavior. They captured the echo of repetition, the fact that something had happened here often enough to matter. The planet stored this information not as image, but as condition. Condition is memory stripped of narrative. Ash had taught the Earth how to remember without recalling. Silence had taught life how to persist without announcing itself. Now stone learned how to carry traces of something it could not recognize as living. This learning changed the planet. Layers began to differ not just in composition, but in tendency. Some strata encouraged complexity, others resisted it. These differences did not advertise themselves. They revealed themselves only over time through what they allowed to return and what they quietly discouraged. The Earth became a map written in probability. If a forgotten civilization had ever existed before the Archean, this is how it would have survived completely beyond retrieval, not as structure, not as knowledge, but as geological inclination. A world that leaned gently towards certain outcomes because it had leaned that way before. Nothing in these layers could be excavated and named intelligent. Nothing bore design, and yet the planet behaved as though it had been taught. Teaching does not require a teacher to remain. Pressure continued its patient work, layers compressed, folded, transformed. Whatever traces existed were simplified further, stripped of detail until only influence remained. This simplification protected them. Detailed records shatter, abstract ones endure. Abstraction is the fossilization of meaning. The sky above continued its blinking, light and darkness alternated. Life continued its quiet persistence. But beneath all of this, the Earth's archive grew denser, not in artifacts, but in tendencies that shaped what could happen next. Certain reactions became easier, certain collapses less catastrophic, certain continuities more likely to return. These shifts were not dramatic, they were cumulative, each one too small to notice, together shaping the planet's future profoundly. The Earth did not distinguish between cause and effect here. It carried both forward together, folded into the same layers. The past no longer existed as something separate. It functioned as constraint. Constraint is memory that cannot be argued with. These fossils that were never alive did not point backward. They pointed sideways, shaping the present. They did not tell a story. They enforced a bias. They whispered, without sound, that something had happened often enough to become normal. Normal is the most powerful fossil. Life moved through these layers unaware of their guidance. It believed, if belief can be said to exist, that the world was simply the way it was. It did not know that the ground beneath it leaned gently toward its survival. The planet did not reveal this inheritance. Revealing would have required separation. The Earth preferred integration. Integration hides its origins. Deep time continued to press. The archive thickened. Fossils without bodies accumulated, influencing what came next without ever demanding to be seen. The world prepared itself to be misunderstood by every future intelligence that would walk upon it. They would look for ruins. They would find laws. And laws, once established at planetary scale, do not remember who first obeyed them. But what the Earth carried forward was not obedience. It was endurance. These were the fossils that were never alive. Silent witnesses to a history that could not be told, only enacted again and again through the way the planet allowed complexity to return. And beneath them all, the silence held, patient, compressive, waiting to shape the next inheritance. As the archive deepened, the Earth grew more selective without choosing. Selection here did not resemble preference in the way minds understand it. It resembled gravity, unarguable, impersonal, shaping outcomes simply by existing. Stone learned how to remember pressure. Layers compressed not only into thickness, but into inclination. The planet's crust began to behave as though it had opinions, not spoken, not conscious, but persistent. Certain arrangements were welcomed. Others were quietly discouraged, not destroyed, just made less likely to return. Likelihood is the planet's most enduring language. These fossils without their bodies did not age the way bones would later age. They did not fracture cleanly or erode visibly. They softened into the background, becoming indistinguishable from the stone that held them. Their power came from this invisibility. Nothing tried to remove them. Nothing knew they were there. What cannot be seen cannot be erased deliberately. Life continued its quiet persistence above these layers, unaware that the ground itself had learned from its earlier attempts. Where life had once lingered, the Earth subtly adjusted, chemistry shifted, gradients softened, reactions became slightly more forgiving. The environment remembered for life again. Memory remained external. This mattered more than any internal replication ever could. It meant that even when fragile continuities collapsed entirely, the conditions that had allowed them to exist remained, waiting for their return in altered form. Extinction did not erase influence. It redistributed it. Redistribution is survival without identity. Pressure continued to work these layers, compressing influence into simpler and simpler forms. What began as complex alteration became constraint. What began as behavior became boundary. The Earth did not preserve detail. It preserved permission. Permission is the rarest fossil. The sky blinked above, still mediating light and darkness. The surface responded, still adjusting patiently. But beneath all of this, the planet's archive had reached a new depth. The past no longer merely shaped the present. It governed it quietly. Governance without governors is stability perfected. If a forgotten civilization had once existed before the Archean, this was where its influence became absolute and unreachable. Not because it ruled, but because it had vanished into the rules themselves. No trace could point back to intention. Only outcomes remained. The Earth behaved as though it had always been this way. The oldest layers were now unreachable, not just physically, but conceptually. Even if future minds would someday dig this deep, there would be nothing recognizable to find. No shapes, no signals, no messages, only stone that behaved a certain way under certain conditions, stone that preferred continuity. These preferences mattered. They shaped how continents would later form, how oceans would gather, how atmospheres would breathe. They shaped where life would flourish and where it would struggle, long before life could ask why. The planet's silence deepened further, not as emptiness, but as authority. Silence now enforced limits. It shaped what could persist without ever speaking. Authority without voice is the most difficult to challenge. Life above continued its slow rehearsal of continuity. It did not yet know complexity, competition, or struggle. It knew only fit, and fit was guided by a world that had already learned how to host without revealing how. This hosting was not generous, it was exact. The Earth allowed what aligned with its deep habits. Everything else dissolved quietly, nothing argued and nothing appealed. Appeals require witnesses. There were none. Time pressed on thick and patient. The archive no longer grew quickly, it refined itself. Each new layer did not add much. It confirmed what had already been learned. Confirmation strengthened bias. Bias became destiny. Destiny here did not mean future events. It meant constrained possibility. The fossils that were never alive now shaped the planet more than any living thing ever could. They were not relics of organisms, they were relics of repetition, of survival tried often enough to become law. The Earth did not remember the attempts, it remembered the outcomes. And this remembering, stripped of narrative and emotion, became the foundation upon which all future life would mistake chance for inevitability. Some truths do not need witnesses to endure. They only need time to press them into stone. The silence held. Deep time no longer felt like passage. It felt like pressure. Constant, patient, patient, unrelenting. The Earth did not move away from its past. It leaned into it. Each new layer did not cover what lay beneath so much as agree with it, aligning itself to tendencies already learned. Agreement is how memory survives without conflict. These fossils without bodies did not fade. They diffused. What had once been localized influence spread outward through stone, carried by heat, by stress, by the slow breathing of the planet's interior. Influence became regional, then planetary. No single place held the past anymore. The past held everything. Life above continued its quiet cycles, unaware that the ground beneath it had begun to speak a language older than life itself. Where continuity had once been possible, it remained possible. Where collapse had dominated, collapse continued. The Earth did not experiment endlessly. It refined. Refinement replaces curiosity at planetary scale. Pressure transformed layers again and again, turning subtle preferences into constraints that could not be negotiated with. Chemistry encountered invisible walls. Heat followed inherited corridors. Water, when it would later arrive in permanence, would obey paths already rehearsed. The future was being narrowed gently, not toward a single outcome, but away from countless failures. Avoidance is the planet's deepest intelligence. The silence governing this process was no longer gentle. It was firm, not harsh, but undeniable. There was no appeal beyond it. Whatever aligned endured, whatever resisted dissolved back into possibility. Possibility is infinite. Persistence is selective. The oldest fossils without life now existed only as behavior. Stone bent where it had learned to bend. Fractures chose familiar routes. The planet reacted to stress as though it had been stressed before, even when the surface showed no visible sign of memory. This invisibility made the memory indestructible. No catastrophe could erase it because no catastrophe could locate it. Impacts struck, eruptions rose, surfaces reworked themselves endlessly, but the underlying tendencies remained. The Earth absorbed disturbance and returned to its preferred behaviors without hesitation. Habit outlasts trauma. If ancient intelligence had once existed before the Archean, this was its final transformation. Not into myth, not into ruin, but into inevitability. The planet no longer needed guidance because guidance had become indistinguishable from physics. Physics is memory that forgot it was learned. Life continued to inherit this silence without understanding it. It adapted not to events, but to rules it could not appear to see. It survived where survival had been rehearsed long before it arrived. It failed where failure had always been more likely. The Earth did not favour life, it favoured continuation, and life, shaped by this favouritism without intention, learned to mistake endurance for virtue. It would later build stories around this misunderstanding. It would call survival success, dominance, purpose, but here none of that existed yet. There was only a planet that had learned what could not be allowed to happen again, and had buried that knowledge so deeply that it could never be questioned. The fossils that were never alive now governed the world quietly. They did not watch, they did not judge, they simply constrained, shaping every future moment without ever appearing inside it. This is how the deepest past remains present, not as memory recalled, but as possibility narrowed. And as this chapter continued to press inward, the Earth carried forward a silence heavy enough to shape worlds, light enough to remain unnoticed. Some inheritances are not stories, they are boundaries. The longer these boundaries held, the more the planet began to behave as though choice itself had narrowed, not in the sense of fate, but in the sense of habit grown so deep it felt indistinguishable from necessity. The Earth did not remember alternatives. It remembered outcomes. Outcomes are heavier than events. Stone no longer merely responded to pressure. It anticipated it, not consciously, not deliberately, but through arrangements refined by repetition. When stress arrived, it moved where it had always moved. When heat accumulated, it escaped along corridors it had learned long ago. Nothing asked whether these paths were optimal. They were familiar. Familiarity was enough. This familiarity shaped everything above. Life, still quiet, still small, moved within a world whose responses had already been decided by histories it could not access. Where the ground yielded gently, life lingered. Where it resisted sharply, life withdrew. These withdrawals were not failures, they were instructions written in disappearance. Disappearance is one of the planet's most fluent teachers. The fossils that were never alive did not accumulate as objects. They accumulated as absences, places where something could not happen anymore, directions that no longer led anywhere survivable. Over time, these absences became as influential as presence, perhaps more so. The Earth learned that subtraction is a powerful form of memory. Layer by layer, the archive refined itself not by adding information, but by removing ambiguity. The range of tolerable outcomes narrowed, not towards simplicity, but towards stability. What remained possible remained so because it had survived countless rehearsals of collapse. Survival did not feel triumphant. It felt inevitable. Deep beneath the surface, metamorphosis continued its quiet labour. Old stone rearranged itself into new configurations that preserved constraint while erasing origin. cause and effect blurred. The planet no longer needed to know why it behaved the way it did. It only needed to continue behaving that way. Reason is a luxury of minds. Planets rely on consistency. Above, life adapted to this consistency without awareness. It did not struggle against the rules because it could not see them. It simply failed where failure had been prepared for and endured where endurance had been practiced long before it arrived. This alignment did not make life dominant. It made it compatible. Compatibility is the rarest survival trait. The silence governing these processes deepened again, not into emptiness, but into authority so complete it no longer felt imposed. Silence became background truth, a condition so stable it was mistaken for neutrality. Neutrality is often inherited discipline. The planet's future now moved within corridors carved by these fossilized absences. Continents would later drift along paths already suggested. Oceans would later gather where gathering had been rehearsed. Atmospheres would later breathe according to balances already enforced. All of this was decided without decision. If a forgotten civilization had once existed before the Archean, nothing of it could be separated from this moment. Its final trace was not knowledge, but narrowing, not design, but the quiet elimination of futures that could not endure. Elimination is not cruelty at planetary scale, it is memory protecting itself. The Earth carried this protection forward without emotion. It did not grieve what could no longer happen. Grief requires awareness of loss. The planet simply adjusted to what remained. Life, inheriting this adjusted world, would never know how much had been removed to make its existence possible. It would mistake the narrowness of possibility for freedom, unaware of the countless paths that had been closed gently, silently, long before it arrived. The fossils that were never alive had now become the planet's deepest law, not written, not enforced, simply present. And laws that are never spoken cannot be broken. They can only be lived inside. As this chapter continued to compress inward, the Earth held its silence firmly, not as a void but as a boundary that shaped every future motion without ever revealing itself. Some memories do not fade, they harden. Nothing concluded when these laws settled. Conclusion would have required awareness, a moment of recognition that something had finished forming. The Earth did not recognize. It continued, and in continuing it carried forward a silence now dense enough to shape everything that followed. The fossils that were never alive no longer needed reinforcement. They had crossed into inevitability. Stress obeyed them. Heat obeyed them. Water, when it would later roam freely, would obey them too. Not out of submission, but because alternatives had been pressed out of existence. Existence narrows as endurance deepens. These fossils did not announce themselves as constraints, they appeared as ease, as the way things simply happened, the way fractures opened where they always had, the way surfaces yielded here and resisted there, the way some chemistries felt natural and others never quite took hold. Natural is often inherited effort forgotten. Life moved within this inheritance quietly, still without ambition, still without dominance. It did not test boundaries deliberately. It encountered them accidentally, learning where continuation was possible and where it was not. Each encounter refined the planet's memory further, not by adding information, but by confirming what already held. Confirmation is memory settling into law. The Earth's silence now carried weight, not oppressive, authoritative, a silence that did not invite argument because it offered no language in which to argue. This silence shaped not only what could exist, but how existence itself behaved. Even change moved differently now. It arrived measured, distributed, rarely catastrophic. When catastrophe came, it did not erase everything. It rearranged within limits already defined. The planet had learned how to bruise without breaking. Bruising preserves structure. Deep time thickened further. The oldest influences were now so diffuse they could not be isolated, even in imagination. They did not belong to a place or a moment. They belonged to behavior, to how the planet responded, not why. Why had become irrelevant. If intelligence had once existed before the Archean, it no longer mattered whether it had been deliberate or accidental. Its final form was indistinguishable from physics. No excavation could reveal intention. No future mind could reconstruct motive. This was not failure, it was completion. The Earth no longer needed stories of its past. Stories are fragile. It carried outcomes instead, compact, silent, unarguable. These outcomes shape the future without requiring belief. Belief is optional. Constraint is not. Life inherited this world without knowing it had been curated by absence. It would later build complexity, competition, consciousness, and mistake these for beginnings. It would look backward and see only randomness where preparation had once laboured for ages. The planet would not correct this misunderstanding. Silence does not clarify, it endures. As this chapter thinned into what followed, the fossils that were never alive did not fade. They disappeared into normalcy, into the taken-for-granted behaviour of stone and sea and sky, into the rules that no one remembers learning. They became the ground, and upon that ground everything else would rise, believing itself new, unaware that it moved inside a world already shaped by forgotten endurance. Some inheritances are not discovered, they are lived inside. What if Earth once knew something, and forgot? Not forgot the way minds forget, misplacing details, losing names, but forgot the way stone forgets pressure once it has learned how to hold it, forgot the way ash forgets fire once it has taught the ground how to be patient, forgot the way silence forgets noise after it has shaped endurance. The planet does not remember stories, it remembers outcomes. By the time everything that could leave a mark had learned how not to, the Earth had already become complete in a way that requires no witnesses. Complete not as finished, but as capable of continuing without explanation, capable of carrying forward without needing to look back. Nothing was lost, everything was folded into rules that no one remembers learning, folded into tendencies mistaken for nature, folded into silence so deep it feels like absence. The question of a forgotten civilization no longer matters here, because if something once arranged itself against chaos before the Archean, its final success would be this, a world that no longer needs to remember it to function as if it had learned from it. Civilization is fragile, habit is not. The Earth carries habit. It carries the habit of distributing stress instead of hoarding it, the habit of slowing violence instead of erasing it, the habit of allowing fragility to try again instead of demanding permanence. These habits do not announce their origin, they do not carry signatures, they do not require belief. They operate quietly, shaping what can exist without ever explaining why. And so the planet continues, hosting life that believes itself new, hosting intelligence that believes itself first, hosting questions that feel unprecedented because the answers were pressed into stone long before language existed to ask them. The deepest past does not argue with the present, it underwrites it. Every ocean trench carries the memory of restraint learned when water could not yet stay. Every stable continent carries the echo of motion slowed just enough not to tear itself apart. Every living cell carries an inheritance older than biology, the discipline of silence learned before life knew how to speak. This is not nostalgia. Planets do not long. This is continuity, uncelebrated, unacknowledged, and absolute. What was forgotten was not knowledge. Knowledge can be lost. What was forgotten was authorship, and perhaps that forgetting was necessary. Because authorship invites ownership invites defense invites collapse. The Earth learned early that survival at planetary scale requires anonymity. Influence must erase its fingerprints. Guidance must look like inevitability. Memory must become law so quiet it cannot be challenged. So the planet does not ask whether something came before. It behaves as if whatever mattered has already been integrated. Time does not pass here. It settles, layer upon layer, era upon era, silence upon silence, each one pressing gently into the last, making forgetting indistinguishable from wisdom. The future walks upon this compression believing it stands on blank ground. Blankness is the planet's greatest illusion, because beneath every step, beneath every breath, beneath every thought that believes itself alone, there is a world that has practiced surviving longer than anything alive could imagine, not remembering, enduring. And now, wherever this listening drifts towards sleep, the Earth does not demand belief. It does not require agreement. It simply continues doing what it has always done best. Holding, moderating, allowing, while the stars above whisper light that the planet has already learned how to soften. Some truths are not meant to be found, they are meant to be lived inside. The question returns, softer now, almost weightless. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? Or what if forgetting was the knowing? The answer does not arrive as sound, it arrives as easing. As the planet exhales into another night that does not know it is night, the question loosens its edges. It no longer needs to be held tightly. It can rest where it belongs, inside the long breath of stone and sea and sky, where answers do not resolve, they settle. Forgetting here is not absence. It is completion without signature. The earth has never been empty. Even in its quietest ages, even when nothing could endure long enough to be named, it was full of instruction. Not instruction written for minds, but instruction embedded in outcome, what survived, what softened, what learned how not to break. This is how the planet speaks, not in sentences, but in continuance. The stars above do not ask whether they were first. They burn, scatter, fade, and in their fading leave behind elements that learn how to become worlds. The earth does not ask whether it was taught. It carries forward what works and lets the rest dissolve back into possibility. Nothing is lost that way, nothing essential anyway. Intelligence, when it appears, believes it is discovering laws. It names gravity, it names time, it names survival. But naming is not origin. Naming is arrival at something long prepared. The planet does not correct this misunderstanding, it allows it. Allowance is the Earth's final kindness, somewhere beneath continents that will shift again, beneath oceans that will one day close and reopen, beneath lives that will rise, vanish, and leave stories behind. The deepest memory remains untouched. Not because it is hidden, but because it has become the ground itself. Ground does not remember footsteps, it makes walking possible. So the idea of a forgotten civilization does not end in proof or denial. It ends in atmosphere, in a feeling that the world is older than its explanations, that balance arrived too early to be accidental, that endurance learned itself long before anything could admire it. This feeling is not meant to be resolved. It is meant to be felt once and then allowed to fade. As sleep approaches, the planet does not watch. It does not listen. It simply continues holding everything exactly as it must, neither too tightly nor too loosely, so that tomorrow, and the next billion tomorrows after that, can arrive without needing permission. The stars whisper. The earth does not answer. It has already learned what it needed to know, and so the circle closes without closing. The beginning rests inside the ending. The question rests inside the silence. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? Time does not reply. Stone does not reply. Silence does not reply. They endure. And in that endurance, the knowing remains, unnamed, unclaimed, unending, soft enough to sleep beside. Nothing more needs to be said. That is how the deepest endings arrive. The earth does not close doors. It lowers sound. It dims urgency. It lets questions soften until they no longer press for shape. In this quiet, the planet returns to its oldest posture. Not waiting, not watching, simply being what it has learned how to be. Being is enough. The ground holds without gripping. The sky drifts without deciding. The stars continue their distant labour, burning and forgetting themselves into light that will one day become something else entirely. No one directs this. No one needs to. Direction has already dissolved into habit. Sleep here is not escape, it is alignment. A settling into the same rhythm stone has always known. The rhythm of pressure easing into form, of time laying itself down gently, layer by layer, without asking to be remembered. Thoughts loosen, edges blur, silence widens. The question that opened this journey no longer stands apart. It has been folded into breath, into stillness, into the quiet understanding that some knowledge only survives by disappearing into everything. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? The Earth does not answer because it no longer distinguishes between knowing and being. Knowing was never the goal, endurance was, continuation was, holding without needing to name what is being held. That lesson has already been passed on. It moves through tides that rise and fall without memory of their first pull, through mountains that stand without recalling the heat that lifted them, through life that persists without remembering how carefully the world learned to allow it. This is not mystery, it is rest. Time slows not because it stops, but because nothing here is in a hurry anymore. The future does not rush toward the present, the past does not press upward. Everything meets in the middle and stays there for a while. Staying is the rarest motion, and so the earth continues, quiet, complete, unannounced, carrying its forgotten wisdom the way night carries stars. Without effort, without explanation, without concern for who notices, the silence deepens, not into emptiness but into comfort. A silence that does not ask for attention. A silence that can be trusted to remain. If sleep arrives now, it arrives naturally. The way continents arrive where oceans once waited, the way ash arrives where fire has finished teaching, no conclusion follows, no answer arrives, no voice interrupts. Only the planet, still breathing, still holding, still remembering how to forget what does not need to be carried as memory anymore. The circle does not close. It rests, and in that rest, everything that mattered remains.